I sat quietly at the dining table I built with my own two hands, chewing my roast beef while my only son looked me dead in the eye and gave me an ultimatum. He told me to give his wife my master bedroom, pack my things into the damp basement storage room, or get out of my own house. I chose the third option, but not the way he expected. 10 days later, I was drinking coffee on my new mountain balcony, listening to my phone buzz with their frantic tears as a corporate demolition crew threw them onto the sidewalk. Let me tell you how it happened. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a harsh lesson to someone who mistreated you. My name is Ruben. I am 70 years old, a retired master electrician, and a man who believed that if you poured your sweat, blood, and soul into a home, it would shelter your family for generations. I was wrong. The clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only sound breaking the heavy, suffocating tension in the dining room. I was sitting at the head of the oak table I had carved and assembled 3 decades ago. Across from me sat my son Jalen and his wife Madison. Madison let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, pushing her plate away. She started complaining, her voice a sharp, grating whine about how the lighting in the guest bedroom was absolutely ruining her social media videos. She went on and on about how the shadows were terrible for her brand, and how she simply could not film her lifestyle content in such a cramped, dismal space. Then she looked right past me and told Jalen that the master bedroom was the only room in the house with the perfect bay windows. She spoke about my room, the sanctuary, where my late wife Cynthia and I had spent 35 years, as if it were a vacant hotel suite just waiting for her ring lights and camera tripods. I did not interrupt her. I did not raise my voice or express my outrage. I simply cut a piece of my roast beef, chewed it slowly, and continued eating in complete silence. My silence was not submission, it was observation. I was taking the measure of the 2 strangers sitting at my table. Jalen suddenly slammed his fork down on the mahogany table. The sudden noise made the crystal water glasses vibrate. He leaned forward, his face flushed with a sudden, unearned arrogance. He did not ask me. He ordered me. He told me that Madison's online following was growing, that they were on the verge of securing major brand deals, and that they desperately needed the space to build their empire. He pointed a finger at my chest and demanded that I surrender the master bedroom by this weekend. His exact instructions were for me to move my belongings down into the damp, unfinished basement storage room. When I did not immediately nod in compliance, his tone turned vicious. He told me that if I did not like the basement, I could pack my bags and leave the property completely. My own son, living rent-free under my roof, looked me in the eyes and called me dead weight. He said I was holding them back from their potential, that an old man did not need a room with a view, and that I was being selfish for holding on to space I was no longer using properly. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air, a toxic cloud polluting the home I had worked my entire life to maintain. He was laying claim to my territory, acting as the lord of a manor he had not contributed a single dime to build. I lowered my fork and looked down at my hands. They were heavily calloused, rough as sandpaper, and permanently scarred from 40 long years of pulling industrial wire, threading copper through freezing construction sites and enduring blistering summers to pay the mortgage on this very house. I had built a life with these hands, ensuring my family never knew the sting of poverty. Then I looked at Jalen's hands resting on the table. They were perfectly smooth, soft, and manicured, currently busy tapping away on a newly released smartphone that I knew he could not actually afford. He had never swung a hammer. He had never changed a tire. He had never known the back-breaking sacrifice required to actually own the ground he was sitting on. My mind drifted briefly to Cynthia. Before the breast cancer finally took her away from me, I held her fragile hand in that very master bedroom. I made a solemn promise to her that I would keep this house in the family, that it would be a lasting sanctuary for our bloodline. I had kept my promise. I had paid off every single cent of the mortgage just so Jalen would have a secure future. But looking at the cold, entitled sneer on his face, I realized that the boy Cynthia and I had raised was completely gone. He had been replaced by a greedy, hollow shell of a man. The sanctuary had become a prison. I did not give Jalen the satisfaction of a shouting match. Yelling is what powerless people do when they have lost control of a situation. I possessed absolute control. I took my cloth napkin, calmly wiped the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. I pushed my chair back, stood up to my full height, and walked silently away from the dining table. As I made my way down the hallway, I heard Jalen let out a harsh, victorious scoff. He leaned over and whispered loudly to Madison, bragging that the stubborn old man had finally folded. He actually believed he had broken my spirit. I stepped into the master bedroom and gently closed the door behind me. I did not walk over to the closet to pull out my suitcases. I did not start packing my clothes or folding my sweaters for a miserable move down to a cold concrete basement. Instead, I walked straight over to the heavy steel floor safe tucked away in the corner of my closet. I spun the dial, entering the combination Cynthia and I had chosen decades ago. The heavy door clicked open. I reached inside and pulled out the original notarized property deed, perfectly crisp and free of any liens. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and dialed the direct line of a notoriously ruthless corporate real estate developer I had met years ago. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. It was time to sell the house. The crisp morning air usually cleared my head, but the walk back to my own front door felt like marching toward a battle line. I unlocked the heavy oak door I had hung myself 30 years ago, expecting the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Instead, the sharp tearing sound of heavy-duty plastic echoed from the hallway. I stepped inside and froze. 6 massive black trash bags lined the corridor outside the master bedroom. Madison was humming a cheerful pop song, dragging a 7th bag across the hardwood floor. Through the half-open bedroom door, I saw the absolute desecration of my late wife's sanctuary. Madison was indiscriminately throwing Cynthia's antique silver vanity set, her carefully preserved silk scarves, and her hand-stitched vintage dresses into the garbage. She was making room for 2 towering, glaringly bright ring lights and a massive vanity mirror designed for her makeup tutorials. Cynthia had cherished those dresses. She wore that silver silk scarf to our 25th anniversary dinner. I had paid off the mortgage by working double shifts just so Cynthia could pass away in peace inside a home that belonged entirely to her, surrounded by the things she loved. Now her entire legacy was being stuffed into municipal waste bags by a woman who had not contributed a single dollar to the property tax. Madison did not even pause when she noticed me standing there. She just kicked a delicate mahogany jewelry box into the hallway, leaving a deep scratch on the polished floorboards I had laid by hand. She treated my wife's life like a disposable prop standing in the way of her social media aesthetics. The level of blatant disrespect was staggering. I stepped forward and placed my hand firmly on the trash bag she was dragging. I looked directly into Madison's eyes and told her to step away from my wife's belongings immediately. Madison let out a loud, theatrical groan and rolled her eyes toward the ceiling. She crossed her arms and told me to stop being so incredibly sentimental over worthless junk. She claimed the room was suffocating and smelled like an antique store, insisting that her brand required a modern, minimalist aesthetic. Before I could respond, Jalen marched out of the kitchen, holding a mug of artisan coffee I had bought with my own money. He did not reprimand his wife. He did not apologize for the blatant disrespect of his own mother's memory. Instead, he stepped between us and puffed out his chest. He impatiently demanded to know why my mattress had not been moved down to the basement yet. He reminded me of his ultimatum from the dinner table, stating that his patience was running extremely thin. He complained that they had a contractor coming to measure the walls, and that my presence in the hallway was actively delaying their schedule. He looked at the bags of his mother's cherished possessions and told me to take the garbage out on my way downstairs. The absolute lack of shame in his voice was chilling. He was treating the erasure of his mother's life as a minor inconvenience in his day. I looked at the boy I had taught to tie his shoes, and I felt nothing but a cold, calculating emptiness. He was actively trying to break me down, to force me into submission under my own roof. I did not waste my breath arguing with people who lacked a basic moral compass. Arguments require mutual respect, and there was absolutely none left in this house. I quietly bent down and began gathering the heavy black trash bags one by one. I slung them over my broad shoulders using the strength I had maintained from decades of carrying heavy spools of industrial copper wire. I carried Cynthia's memories safely away from their destructive hands, hauling them toward the basement stairwell to protect them from further harm. Jalen smirked, crossing his arms as he watched me work, clearly mistaking my silence for total submission. He turned his back and carelessly kicked a cardboard box of old mail out of his way, sending it crashing against the hallway baseboard. Envelopes and scattered papers spilled across the floor in a messy pile. After securing the last trash bag on the basement landing, I returned to clean up the mess Jalen had so proudly made. As I knelt to gather the scattered mail, a specific thick envelope caught my eye. It was from a major national bank, and it was addressed directly to Jalen. However, the mailing address printed below his name was my house. Jalen had not received mail here in over a decade, not since he briefly moved into a luxury downtown loft he eventually lost to a brutal eviction. My instincts, sharpened by years of navigating deceitful contractors and predatory lenders, immediately flared. I picked up the envelope, analyzing the official logo. The paper was exceptionally thick, carrying the unmistakable weight of a certified financial disclosure. It was not a standard credit card offer or a simple bank statement. It was a formal legal notice that demanded immediate attention. I tore open the seal without a single second of hesitation. I unfolded the crisp pages and scanned the bold black text. It was a formal banking notice regarding an active home equity line of credit. The document detailed a massive recent withdrawal and listed a staggering outstanding balance of $150,000. The credit line was directly tied to the exact address of my house, the home I owned free and clear. I read the fine print twice, my heart pounding a steady, furious rhythm against my ribs. Jalen had not merely demanded the master bedroom to appease his arrogant wife. He had secretly weaponized my flawless financial standing. I had guarded my credit score fiercely, my entire life, viewing it as a badge of honor for a black man who had built his wealth from absolutely nothing. Now that pristine record had been hijacked. I flipped to the final page of the disclosure and saw my own name signed on the authorization line. It was a flawless professional forgery. Jalen had used fake digital proxies to bypass the bank's security measures, leveraging the fully paid-off home I built to borrow against my hard-earned equity. He was bleeding the house dry from the inside out to fund his fake millionaire lifestyle. The demand to move into the basement was not just about extra space. It was about establishing total physical dominance over an asset he had already stolen behind my back. The conflict shifted instantly. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a bedroom. This was a severe financial crime committed by my own flesh and blood. Jalen and Madison strutted out the front door the very next morning, carrying matching designer weekend bags. Madison was loudly vlogging her outfit of the day to her phone camera, announcing to her followers that they were off to an exclusive influencer retreat in the Hamptons. Jalen tossed his car keys into the air, catching them with a smug grin. He threw a quick glance over his shoulder and reminded me to have my mattress out of the master bedroom by the time they returned on Sunday evening. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, leaving the house in sudden, absolute silence. I did not waste a single second. With the bank disclosure burning a hole in my jacket pocket, I knew exactly what my next move had to be. I made a phone call to a man named Maxwell. Maxwell was an aggressive corporate real estate developer I had met years ago during a commercial electrical job. I was notorious across the city for buying up premium residential properties, for straight cash bulldozing the existing structures and erecting high-density luxury condominiums in their place. He was not a man who dealt in emotions or nostalgia. He dealt entirely in rapid, ruthless acquisitions. Within 2 hours, a sleek black luxury vehicle pulled into my driveway. Maxwell stepped out wearing a sharp, tailored suit, carrying a digital tablet. He did not knock. He walked right up to the front porch, looking at the brickwork with the cold, calculating eyes of a predator assessing a meal. I opened the door and ushered him inside the home I had spent 40 years maintaining. Maxwell stepped past the threshold and immediately began appraising the property with clinical coldness. He tapped on walls to check for load-bearing studs, measured the hallway dimensions with a laser device, and inspected the foundational integrity without offering a single word of polite conversation. He completely ignored the custom mahogany panels I had carved by hand and paid zero attention to the vintage stained glass windows Cynthia had picked out during our first anniversary. To him, my home was nothing more than a tactical asset waiting to be leveled. I mirrored his exact energy. I showed absolutely no emotional attachment as I guided him through the living room, the kitchen, and the contested master bedroom. I treated my lifelong sanctuary like a simple square-footage commodity. When we finally returned to the kitchen island, Maxwell set his tablet down. He looked at me with a flat, business-like expression. He offered to buy the property for straight cash. The number he presented was a staggering 30% below the actual market value. However, he guaranteed a frictionless 10-day closing period and absolute ironclad confidentiality. He promised that the transaction would remain entirely off the public market until the ink was dry and the deed was fully transferred. No open houses, no viewing appointments, and no for sale signs planted in the front yard. It was the perfect invisible strike I needed to pull the rug out from under my son and his arrogant wife. I looked Maxwell dead in the eye and agreed to his terms on the spot. While Maxwell logged into his corporate portal to initiate the preliminary contract, I walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at the front driveway. The morning sun was casting long, familiar shadows across the concrete. I stood there staring at the exact spot where I had taught Jalen how to ride his first bicycle. I remembered running alongside him, my hand firmly gripping the back of his small seat, my lungs burning as I cheered him on. I remembered the bright, innocent smile on his face when I finally let go, and he pedaled forward on his own, completely free and safe. Cynthia had been standing right on the porch holding a pitcher of lemonade, cheering for her beautiful boy. I had built this house to protect that smile. I had wired every outlet, fixed every leak, and worked myself to the bone, so my son would never have to understand the harsh, cruel realities of the world I grew up in. I stood there trying to pinpoint the exact moment his heart turned to solid ice. When did the boy who used to fall asleep on my chest while we watched football turn into a man willing to forge my name and throw me into a damp basement? The realization was a heavy, bitter pill to swallow. I had sheltered him so completely from struggle that he never learned the value of hard work or the meaning of respect. I had unintentionally cultivated his staggering entitlement. I turned my back to the window, letting the ghost of that sweet little boy fade away. I had to focus on the ruthless grown man who was currently bleeding me dry. Maxwell tapped the screen of his tablet with his stylus, loading the county property database to verify my ownership credentials. I watched his fingers move, waiting for the satisfying finality of the digital paperwork. Suddenly, his rapid tapping stopped. His sharp professional demeanor shifted into a rigid frown. He swiped the screen twice, squinting at the dense lines of legal text populating his display. He slowly placed the stylus down on the kitchen island and looked up at me with an expression of intense corporate frustration. He bluntly informed me that we could not close the deal. The cash offer was completely off the table. I felt my chest tighten as he turned the tablet around to show me the screen. There, glowing in stark red lettering, was the formal registration of a massive $150,000 active lien on the property. It was the exact line of credit I had discovered in the trash bag that very morning. Maxwell explained in a harsh, uncompromising tone that his firm strictly prohibited purchasing properties with encumbered titles. He said they only dealt in clean assets, and he refused to absorb the legal nightmare of a fraudulent secondary loan. My quiet, brilliant plan to sell the house right out from under Jalen had just slammed into a massive concrete wall. The forgery was not just a secret theft. It was a legally binding shackle tying me to the financial ruin of my son. Maxwell picked up his briefcase, shaking his head. He told me to call him back if I ever cleared the title, but until then he was walking away. I stood alone in the kitchen, realizing my fight was going to be much harder than I thought. I did not wait for the dust to settle in my driveway after Maxwell drove away. I took the heavily creased bank notice, grabbed my coat, and drove straight downtown to the law offices of Gregory Vance. Gregory was not just my attorney. We had known each other for over 50 years. We had marched together during the civil rights movement, linking arms against a world that wanted to keep us at the very bottom. Han had built a ruthless legal reputation, while I had built my electrical contracting business. When I walked into his polished mahogany office and dropped the bank disclosure onto his desk, he took one look at my face and immediately locked his door. I told him my own son had hijacked my house. Gregory sat down at his computer, bypassed the standard customer service channels, and used his legal credentials to pull the exact financial records tied to my property. We sat in silence as the digital paper trail illuminated the staggering depth of Jalen's betrayal. The reality was far worse than a simple forged signature on a piece of paper. Jalen had orchestrated a highly sophisticated digital scheme. He had used fake email addresses routed through dummy IP locations and employed digital proxy signatures to bypass the bank's identity verification protocols. He had successfully leveraged the entire equity of the home I owned free and clear to secure a massive $150,000 business loan. Gregory tracked the disbursement of the funds right there on his monitor. The money had not gone toward building any legitimate business. Thousands of dollars had been funneled directly into Jalen's failing tech startup to cover payroll he could not afford. The rest had been aggressively bled dry by Madison. I stared at the screen, watching my hard-earned equity being siphoned off to pay for her luxury influencer retreats in Dubai, designer handbags, and high-end camera equipment. They were literally wearing the bricks and mortar of my house. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach as I stared at the screen. I had guarded my financial standing with a fierce, uncompromising discipline my entire adult life. As a black man born in an era where banks actively redlined our neighborhoods and denied us basic loans, I knew that a pristine credit score was armor. I had worked brutal double shifts, lived on cash budgets, and sacrificed personal comforts for decades to build an immaculate 800 credit score. It was a badge of honor, a testament to my survival and my absolute reliability. Now that immaculate record had been compromised, manipulated, and weaponized against me by my own flesh and blood. Gregory took off his reading glasses and threw them onto his desk. His hands were shaking with a furious, barely contained anger. He looked at me with the same fierce protective fire I had seen in his eyes when we faced down riot police 50 years ago. He slammed his fist against the armrest of his leather chair, completely outraged on my behalf. He stated that we had fought systemic oppression our entire lives only to have my own son adopt the tactics of a predatory lender to steal my legacy. The silence in the office grew incredibly heavy as Gregory leaned forward and laid out the cold, hard legal options. The situation was an absolute trap. Gregory explained that Jalen had committed multiple federal offenses by using digital proxies across state lines to secure the funds. He had committed wire fraud. By forging my signature on the primary loan documents, he had committed felony identity theft. Gregory told me that if we picked up the phone and reported the fraudulent lien to the bank's fraud department, Jalen would be indicted. He would face a minimum of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The bank would immediately freeze his accounts, seize his assets, and the government would absolutely destroy him. However, if I chose not to report the fraud, I was legally acknowledging the debt as my own. If I remained silent, the $150,000 lien would remain permanently attached to the deed. Maxwell and his corporate buyers would never touch the property. I would be physically trapped in that house, forced to move into a damp basement, while my son and his wife continued to bleed my equity dry until the bank inevitably foreclosed on the property. Jalen had created a perfect hostage situation. I was using his own freedom as a shield, knowing I would hesitate to destroy him. I stood up and walked over to the large glass window overlooking the busy city streets. I watched the cars moving below, thinking about the sheer weight of a federal prison sentence. I thought about the boy I had raised, the one who used to help me sort my tools in the garage. I could not be the man who sent his own son to a concrete cell. I refused to let my final act as a father be the total legal annihilation of my child, regardless of how hollow and greedy he had become. I turned back to Gregory and looked him dead in the eye. I told him we were not calling the authorities and we were not reporting the fraud. Gregory stood up, protesting loudly, warning me that I was letting a thief walk away with my life savings. I raised my hand and silenced him. I told Gregory to draft the paperwork to liquidate my entire private retirement account. Every single liquid dollar I had saved over 40 years of grueling electrical work was going to be drained. I made the shocking choice to use my own money to secretly pay off the entire $150,000 loan in one lump sum. Gregory stared at me in absolute disbelief, but then the true strategy dawned on him. By paying off the loan in full, we would instantly clear the title, freeing the deed for Maxwell to purchase the house for straight Tage. More importantly, closing the credit line, so abruptly without Jalen's knowledge, would automatically sever his only source of income, triggering a catastrophic financial collapse that he would never see coming. I was not sending him to prison, but I was going to let him lock himself inside his own ruin. I sat across from Gregory as he printed the final withdrawal authorizations. The heavy mahogany desk felt like an executioner's block, but I was the one swinging the axe on my own safety net. My retirement account was the culmination of 40 years of breathing in fiberglass dust, crawling through sweltering attics and risking electrocution on municipal grid jobs. Every single dollar represented a day my back ached so badly I could barely walk up the porch steps. Now I was signing away $150,000 in a single ruthless stroke of a pen. Gregory handed me the document. His eyes were heavy with a shared understanding of the massive sacrifice. I did not hesitate. I took the pen and signed my name with absolute conviction. The financial hit was devastating. It was a massive chunk of the security Cynthia and I had painstakingly built over decades of frugal living. I viewed it as the ultimate price for absolute freedom. Money can be replaced, but a man's dignity once surrendered is gone forever. I was buying back the very chain my son had used to shackle me. As the printer hummed, finalizing the liquidation, I felt the heavy burden of my life's labor dissolve into a necessary weapon. I was not just clearing a fraudulent lien. I was severing the toxic cord that tethered me to a boy who viewed my unconditional love as a weakness to be exploited. I slid the signed papers back across the polished wood. Gregory nodded, his expression hardening into a fierce tactical resolve. He processed the transfer, immediately setting the gears of our silent counterstrike into motion. Gregory typed furiously on his keyboard, logging into the secure banking portal to wire the funds directly to the lending institution holding the fraudulent line of credit. He hit the final confirmation key, and the digital ledger updated instantly. The $150,000 balance dropped to zero. We were not merely clearing the title for Maxwell to execute his corporate acquisition. We were actively arming a financial landmine directly beneath Jalen's feet. Gregory explained the precise mechanics of the trap. By paying off the massive debt in one sudden unannounced lump sum, the bank's automated fraud detection systems would immediately sever the credit line. They would flag the account for highly suspicious activity because such a rapid massive payoff on a recently opened high-risk business loan violated standard algorithmic behaviors. The sudden closure of that credit line would instantly choke off Jalen's only source of liquid capital. Furthermore, the bank's compliance division would automatically launch an internal financial audit on Jalen's supposedly thriving tech startup accounts to verify the origin of the funds. My son had built his entire arrogant facade on stolen equity and digital lies. Without my house propping up his fraudulent credit, his corporate house of cards would inevitably collapse. The beauty of the strategy was its total, absolute silence. Jalen would not receive a warning call or a polite letter from a loan officer. He would simply wake up one morning to find his accounts completely frozen, his credit cards declined, and his fake empire completely pulverized. The trap was officially ticking. Gregory handed me the cleared title documentation neatly tucked into 2 thick legal folders. The path was now perfectly clear to sell the house right out from under the thieves who occupied it. I drove back to the house with the heavy legal folders resting securely on the passenger seat. The neighborhood was quiet, basking in the mild afternoon sun. I pulled into the driveway expecting the house to be entirely empty. Jalen and Madison were supposed to be at their exclusive influencer retreat until late Sunday evening. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the living room, intending to immediately call Maxwell and authorize the cash sale. I barely had time to set my keys on the console table before the sound of the garage door opening violently shattered the silence. The heavy interior door swung open, and Jalen marched in, dragging Madison's matching designer luggage. Madison followed closely behind, her face scrunched in a foul, bitter scowl. Apparently, their luxurious weekend had been cut short due to a dispute over a VIP booking, a trivial inconvenience that had completely ruined her carefully planned social media content. I was caught standing dead center in the living room. I had not had the chance to conceal the thick branded legal folders bearing Gregory's prominent law firm logo. Jalen dropped the suitcases onto the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. He narrowed his eyes, zeroing in on the documents in my hands. His posture instantly shifted from annoyance to defensive aggression. A man running a massive financial fraud lives in a constant state of paranoia. Madison stepped out from behind him, her sharp gaze locking onto the paperwork. The sudden tension in the room was palpable. They both stared at me, calculating my every move, silently wondering if the old man they had thrown into the basement had finally figured out how deeply they had robbed him. Madison marched forward, her stilettos clicking sharply against the floorboards. She pointed a manicured finger directly at the documents in my hands. She demanded to know exactly what I was holding and why I was meeting with a high-powered attorney behind their backs. Jalen stepped up beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes betraying a flicker of genuine panic. He knew that if I had discovered the fraudulent home equity line, his entire life was over. The air in the living room grew incredibly thick. I did not flinch. I drew upon decades of stoic discipline, forcing my shoulders to slump slightly and my hands to tremble just enough to sell the performance. I looked at them with the tired, defeated eyes of a broken old man. I seamlessly pivoted my narrative. I told them that the stress of the impending move to the basement had taken a severe toll on my heart. I claimed the folders contained standard medical proxy forms and end-of-life directives. I lied with absolute conviction, stating that my health was rapidly declining, and I needed to ensure my affairs were in order before my condition worsened. The transformation in their demeanor was instantaneous and entirely sickening. Jalen let out a massive visible breath of relief, the panic instantly evaporating from his face. Madison's sharp scowl melted into a triumphant predatory smirk. By feeding their established narrative that I was just a weak, expiring burden, I had completely disarmed them. Jalen patted me condescendingly on the shoulder, telling me it was a smart move for a man my age to accept reality. They brushed past me, eager to resume tearing apart my wife's master bedroom, blissfully unaware that the weak old man standing behind them had just armed the bomb that would obliterate their world. I began the grueling process of moving my entire life into the dark belly of the house. I hauled heavy cardboard boxes down the narrow wooden stairs step by deliberate step. The basement was a stark contrast to the immaculate floors and bright windows of the upper levels. It was a damp, windowless concrete cavern that smelled faintly of old soil and mildew. Dust particles danced in the harsh light of a single exposed bulb swinging from the ceiling rafters. I felt the familiar ache in my lower back, flaring up a sharp reminder of my 70 years, but I embraced the physical pain. It grounded me. Every box I carried down those stairs solidified my performance. to keep Jalen and Madison completely blind to the financial landmine ticking beneath their feet. I had to play the part of the defeated elderly father to absolute perfection. I dragged my heavy winter coats, a stack of personal files, and a few framed photographs into the far corner, setting up a pathetic makeshift living space. It was degrading work. I was voluntarily banishing myself to the subterranean storage room of a property I owned outright. Yet with every trip down into the gloom, my mind remained incredibly sharp. I was not a victim seeking shelter in a dungeon. I was a tactician digging a trench. I folded my clothes into an old plastic bin, listening to the muffled sounds of their heavy footsteps echoing through the ceiling boards directly above me. They were completely oblivious. They thought my silence was the sound of a broken spirit surrendering to their authority. They mistook my tactical retreat for total weakness. The aggressive sound of splintering wood shattered the quiet of my descent. I paused on the staircase and looked up. Jalen was standing at the very top of the landing, leaning casually against the doorframe with a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He held a glass of expensive bourbon, swirling the amber liquid while he looked down at me. He sarcastically asked if the damp air was good for my joints, telling me it was about time I learned how to adapt to their rapidly expanding brand. He did not offer to lift a single box. He simply watched his 70-year-old father strain under the weight of heavy lifting. From down the hall, the screech of a crowbar prying wood from drywall echoed loudly. Madison had wasted absolutely no time. She had already hired a cheap, reckless demolition crew to rip out the custom mahogany wall panels I had painstakingly installed in the master bedroom. I could hear her sharp nasal voice complaining to the workers that the rich, dark wood looked entirely too ethnic and outdated for her clean, minimalist aesthetic. She ordered them to tear it all down and prep the walls for a stark, sterile white paint. She was actively destroying decades of craftsmanship and the beautiful backdrop of my marriage to Cynthia just to film shallow videos for strangers on the internet. Jalen took a slow sip of his drink, chuckling as another piece of mahogany hit the floorboards with a heavy, sickening crash. He told me to hurry up and close the basement door because the dust from my boxes was ruining the air quality in his hallway. I did not respond. I just kept walking down the stairs into the shadows. The basement was freezing. Madison had purposefully locked the smart thermostat upstairs, routing all the warm air to the upper floors while entirely cutting off the vents leading down to my concrete cell. I sat heavily on an old canvas military cot I had dragged out of a forgotten corner. The chill seeped through my thick flannel shirt, settling deep into my aging bones. I rubbed my hands together, feeling the stiff joints protest against the dropping temperature. Sitting alone in the dark, cold silence, a powerful memory rushed back to me. It was the brutal winter of 1998. The old house furnace had completely failed during a historic blizzard. I remembered wrapping a young, shivering Jalen in 3 layers of heavy woolen blankets before kissing his forehead, and promising him he would not be cold for long. I drove my beat-up truck through blinding snow to the municipal transit yard. I worked 72 hours of consecutive double shifts in sub-zero weather, risking severe frostbite to earn the emergency overtime pay required to buy and install a brand new heating system. I had sacrificed my own body to ensure my son slept in a warm, safe environment. The bitter irony of that memory tasted like ash in my mouth. I was now shivering on a rigid cot in the basement while the boy I had kept warm basked in stolen luxury directly above my head. The cold concrete floor beneath my feet was the absolute final proof I needed. I owed him nothing else. My obligations as a father had officially expired. The harsh buzzing of my cell phone vibrating against the metal frame of the cot startled me. I pulled the device from my pocket. The bright glow of the screen illuminated the dark space cutting through the heavy shadows of the basement. It was a text message from Maxwell. The corporate developer did not waste time with pleasantries or unnecessary greetings. The message was incredibly brief and ruthlessly efficient. He confirmed that his legal team had run the final exhaustive title check. The massive fraudulent lion was completely gone. The property deed was officially clean and unencumbered. The $800,000 cash transfer was sitting in a secure escrow account, ready to be wired directly into my offshore account by morning. But Maxwell added one final strict condition before authorizing the release of funds. He stated that his corporation did not deal with tenant disputes or prolonged legal eviction battles. His firm operated under a strict ironclad policy of zero-tolerance police-backed removals. The moment the ink dried and the title transferred, his private security team would coordinate with the county sheriff to forcefully clear the property of any occupants. He needed to know if I was prepared for the brutal reality of what was about to happen to the people living upstairs. I sat in the freezing dark, listening to the muffled sounds of Jalen and Madison laughing as they continued to destroy my home. I felt absolutely no hesitation and no remorse. I stared at the glowing screen, typed 2 words, and pressed send. Executed. I waited until the heavy footsteps upstairs finally ceased, and the house settled into a deep, suffocating silence. It was 3 in the morning. I slipped on my work boots and quietly navigated the dark basement stairs, taking care to avoid the 3rd step that always creaked. Jalen and Madison were dead asleep, completely exhausted from a full day of destroying the master bedroom. I walked out the side door and drove my truck through the empty city streets, heading straight to the downtown legal district. The towering glass building was completely dark, except for the single light burning in Gregory's corner suite. He was waiting for me with a steaming cup of black coffee and a thick stack of finalized real estate documents. Maxwell had sent his corporate courier ahead of time to facilitate the midnight closing. I sat at the large mahogany desk and picked up the heavy gold pen Cynthia had bought me for my 40th birthday. I stared at the property deed one last time. It bore the address where I had built my life, where I had carried my wife over the threshold, where I had raised a son who turned out to be a ruthless stranger. I felt no hesitation. I pressed the pen to the heavy paper and signed my name with absolute finality. The transaction was officially legally binding. My home, the sanctuary I had fought tooth and nail to protect against a harsh world, was now the exclusive property of Apex Holdings. I handed the paperwork back to the courier. The deed was transferred and my hands were washed completely clean of the foundation my son had tried to steal. Gregory took the executed documents and immediately logged into his secure legal banking portal to verify the escrow release. The digital handshake between Maxwell's corporate accounts and my newly established offshore trust took less than 3 minutes. The computer screen refreshed and a bright green notification confirmed the incoming wire transfer. $800,000 had successfully cleared into a highly secure private account that Jalen could never track, touch, or leverage. I stared at the massive number glowing on the monitor, feeling the sheer weight of my entire life's labor suddenly converted into untraceable digital currency. This money was no longer tied to brick and mortar. It was completely untethered, invisible, and perfectly safe from my son's greedy hands. By accepting 30% below market value, I had purchased the ultimate weapon, which was absolute speed and absolute silence. Jalen had forged my signature to steal $150,000 to fund his pathetic fake millionaire lifestyle. I had just quietly liquidated the remaining massive equity right out from under his expensive designer shoes. He was currently sleeping in a house he thought he controlled, completely unaware that the very floorboards beneath his bed now belonged to a faceless corporation that specialized in aggressive evictions. Gregory printed a confirmation receipt and slid it across the polished desk. He looked at me with a deep, solemn respect. The financial trap was fully armed and locked. The bank would soon realize the fraudulent credit line lacked collateral. Jalen's entire house of cards was poised to collapse into absolute dust. Gregory opened his heavy desk drawer and pulled out a sturdy silver keyring. He placed it in the center of the table, right on top of the wire transfer receipt. He had handled the secondary real estate transaction precisely as I had instructed, ensuring total anonymity. He handed me the keys to a stunning, pre-furnished luxury apartment nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. I had purchased the property entirely in cash, using a clean shell company Gregory had set up to ensure Jalen could never trace my location through public tax records. The mountains were a place of profound peace for me. It was where Cynthia and I had spent our honeymoon, breathing in the crisp mountain air far away from the noise and hostility of the city. I pocketed the keys, feeling the cold, heavy metal press against my thigh. It was the physical manifestation of my brand new beginning. I was leaving behind the toxic, suffocating environment my son had created and stepping into a space of absolute tranquility and independence. Gregory stood up and offered his hand. I shook it firmly, feeling the deep, unspoken bond of brotherhood between us. We had executed the silent adjustment flawlessly. I thanked him for his brilliant legal maneuvering and walked out of the office. The dawn was just breaking over the city skyline, casting a pale orange glow across the empty streets. I got back into my truck and drove toward the neighborhood one final time. I needed to collect my single duffel bag from the basement before Maxwell initiated his brutal corporate takeover. I pulled my truck into the driveway just as the sun fully crested the horizon, lighting up the front yard. The house appeared quiet from the outside, but the moment I unlocked the front door, I heard the loud, obnoxious sound of Jalen pacing back and forth in the living room. He was already awake, talking aggressively on his cell phone, pacing with manic energy. I slipped quietly into the hallway, keeping my footsteps light as I headed toward the basement door. Jalen was speaking to an independent contractor loudly demanding immediate service. He was authorizing a massive demolition project for the very next morning. He arrogantly instructed the contractor to bring sledgehammers and a full demolition crew to completely knock down the main load-bearing wall separating the living room from the kitchen. He claimed Madison needed an open-concept floor plan immediately so she could shoot a lucrative brand deal video by the weekend. He smugly guaranteed the contractor double his usual rate, promising that money was absolutely no object because he had just secured total control over his father's estate. I paused with my hand resting on the basement doorknob, listening to his staggering entitlement. He was ordering the physical destruction of a major structural pillar inside a house that currently belonged to Apex Holdings. He was planning to swing a sledgehammer into corporate property. I did not interrupt his phone call. I did not step out to warn him about the catastrophic legal trouble he was about to invite into his life. I simply turned the knob, walked down into the cold concrete basement, and zipped up my heavy canvas duffel bag. I stood in the freezing basement and pulled the heavy brass zipper of my canvas duffel bag shut. It was exactly 4 o'clock in the morning. The house above me was completely silent, save for the occasional settling of the floorboards. I hoisted the bag onto my shoulder, feeling the familiar weight press into my muscles. I walked up the narrow wooden stairs, leaving the dark, damp space behind me for the absolute last time. Stepping into the main hallway, I took a moment to look around. The moonlight filtered through the front windows, casting long silver shadows across the mahogany trim I had carved and sanded with my own hands 30 years ago. I ran my calloused fingertips over the smooth grain of the doorframe leading into the kitchen. I expected to feel a profound wave of grief or a sudden pang of nostalgia for the life I had built within these walls. As I traced the wood, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no attachment and no sorrow. The soul of this house had died the day Cynthia passed away, and the physical structure had been utterly poisoned by Jalen's greed. This place was no longer a sanctuary or a family heirloom. It was just a collection of lumber, drywall, and glass currently owned by a ruthless corporate real estate firm. I was not abandoning my home. I was simply walking out of a hollow shell. The heavy burden I had carried for the last 3 years began to lift from my shoulders, replaced by a surging, deeply intoxicating sense of total liberation. I walked softly past the master bedroom, where my son and his wife were sleeping, completely oblivious to the financial earthquake waiting for them at sunrise. I stepped into the kitchen and walked over to the large marble island. The moonlight caught the glint of my heavy brass keychain resting in my pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the 2 silver house keys dangling from the ring. They represented decades of hard work, sacrifice, and unwavering protection. Now they were just pieces of metal unlocking a door that no longer belonged to me. I looked down at the marble counter and spotted the crumpled $20 bill Jalen had arrogantly tossed at me days prior. He had thrown it down the basement stairs and ordered me to buy my own dinner, treating me like a beggar in my own dining room. I had kept that bill exactly where it landed, moving it to the island as a silent reminder of his total lack of respect. I reached out and smoothed the wrinkled paper flat against the cold stone surface. I took my keyring and placed it precisely in the center of George Washington's face. It was the perfect symbolic gesture. I was leaving him exactly what he valued most, which was money and the illusion of absolute control. He wanted this house so desperately, he was willing to forge my name and throw me into a concrete dungeon. Now he had the keys to a kingdom made of sand. I did not bother leaving a note explaining my departure or expressing any paternal disappointment. Explanations are for people who still care to salvage a relationship. I had nothing left to say to the man sleeping upstairs. I turned my back on the kitchen, adjusted the strap of my duffel bag across my chest, and walked straight out the front door. The heavy lock clicked shut behind me, sealing his fate. The brisk morning air hit my face as I stepped off the porch. I walked down the driveway to my old, reliable pickup truck. The engine roared to life with a familiar, comforting rumble, shattering the quiet stillness of the neighborhood. I pulled out of the driveway without a single backward glance. I navigated through the empty city streets, passing the dark storefronts and silent intersections I had known my entire life. As I merged onto the interstate highway, leaving the city limits behind, the eastern horizon began to crack open with the first vibrant streaks of dawn. A brilliant wave of orange and purple light spilled across the sky, chasing away the darkness of the night. I rolled down my driver's side window, letting the crisp, rushing wind fill the cab of the truck. I took a deep, expansive breath, filling my lungs with clean, fresh air. For the first time in 3 agonizing years, my chest did not feel tight with anxiety or heavy with the burden of Jalen's disrespect. I was finally breathing as a truly free man. The highway stretched out before me, an open road leading directly toward the majestic silhouette of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I turned on the radio, letting the smooth rhythm of an old jazz station wash over me. The miles melted away beneath my tires, carrying me further from the toxicity and deceit of my past. I was driving toward a sanctuary I had purchased with my own blood and sweat, a place where no one could ever diminish my worth or forge my name. The sheer physical relief of putting physical distance between myself and that stolen house was indescribable. I was a man reborn. Several hours into my journey, the scenic mountain roads began winding upwards, surrounded by towering pine trees and sheer rock faces. I pulled into a small roadside diner to grab a cup of black coffee and stretch my legs. As I sat down at a quiet corner booth, my cell phone vibrated sharply in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a rapid succession of text messages from Jalen. He had finally woken up and found the keys resting on the kitchen island. Instead of feeling a shred of concern for his elderly father's sudden disappearance, his messages were dripping with venomous triumph. He texted me that I was a pathetic coward for running away in the middle of the night. He bragged that he and Madison were currently popping a bottle of expensive champagne to celebrate my official surrender. He explicitly ordered me to never contact them again, stating that I was dead to him and that the house was now permanently his domain. I even attached a photo of himself and Madison clinking crystal glasses in the living room with the demolition crew standing in the background ready to tear down the walls. I stared at the photo of my son celebrating a victory that did not exist. He was raising a glass inside a property legally owned by a ruthless corporate developer who was currently dispatching an armed security team to throw him onto the curb. I did not reply to his hateful messages. I simply blocked his number, took a sip of my hot coffee, and smiled at the waitress. The trap was perfectly set, and the countdown to his absolute destruction had officially begun. I parked my truck in the designated space of my new high-elevation complex just as the afternoon sun hit the rugged peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Stepping out of the cab, I took a long, deliberate breath of the crisp, thin air. It was a staggering, beautiful contrast to the heavy, toxic atmosphere I had been suffocating in for the past 3 years. My new apartment was completely pre-furnished, featuring sturdy dark leather seating and a wide stone balcony that overlooked a sweeping valley of ancient green pines. I unlocked the front door and walked straight through the spacious living room, sliding the heavy glass balcony doors wide open to let the mountain breeze sweep through the space. There were no blinding ring lights glaring in my face. There were no entitled voices demanding I scurry down into a damp, freezing basement. There was only the sound of wind rushing through the timber and the distant sharp call of a hawk circling the thermal currents above the tree line. The physical toll of the long, solitary drive completely washed away the moment I sat down in the wooden rocking chair facing the mountains. I pulled my phone from my pocket and poured myself a tall glass of iced tea from the modern stainless steel refrigerator. I had absolutely no intention of calling my son to check on him, but I did open Madison's public social media page. I knew exactly what they were planning to do today, and I wanted a front row seat to their sheer, breathtaking arrogance right before the corporate hammer finally fell. Madison had just started a live video broadcast showing off the absolute desecration of my hard work to thousands of strangers on the internet. She was parading around my former living room wearing a spotless white designer jumpsuit and oversized sunglasses indoors, acting like an eccentric billionaire heiress who had just conquered the world. Jalen stood right behind her, leaning casually on a heavy steel sledgehammer, trying to project the image of a rugged self-made entrepreneur. He looked utterly ridiculous. His soft, manicured hands barely knew how to grip the fiberglass handle. They were actively bragging to their followers about their newly inherited estate, claiming they were about to revolutionize the space by creating a massive open-concept floor plan. In the background, a cheap unlicensed demolition crew was setting up canvas drop cloths and marking the mahogany-trimmed load-bearing wall with bright neon orange chalk. Jalen puffed out his chest and proudly announced to the camera lens that they were finally clearing out the old stagnant energy of the past. He lifted the heavy sledgehammer and took a sloppy, uncoordinated swing at the drywall I had meticulously hung and taped by hand over 3 decades ago. The hammer punched a jagged, dusty hole right through the center of the wall. Madison squealed with delight, clapping her hands and cheering as a thick cloud of white gypsum dust filled the air, raining down and ruining the pristine polished floorboards beneath them. They were completely drunk on their stolen power, firmly believing they were the untouchable masters of a domain they had fraudulently hijacked from an old man. As Jalen pulled the sledgehammer back for a second clumsy swing, a strange heavy vibration began to distort the audio of Madison's live broadcast. At first it sounded like a low, distant hum, but it rapidly escalated into a deep, aggressive roar of high-performance engines accelerating violently down my usually quiet suburban street. The demolition crew immediately stopped their work, lowering their tools as the mechanical noise grew deafeningly loud, rattling the front windows of the house. Madison visibly frowned, her perfect practiced influencer smile, dropping into a sharp, bitter scowl of annoyance. She complained loudly to her viewers that the neighborhood was getting entirely too loud, and that she would have to file a formal noise complaint with the city council to protect her professional filming environment. Jalen dropped the sledgehammer onto the floor, leaving a deep, permanent dent in the hardwood. He marched confidently toward the front windows, intending to yell at whoever was ruining his moment of online triumph. I sat comfortably on my mountain balcony, taking a slow sip of my iced tea as I watched the live feed with intense, focused anticipation. Through the glare of the window on the video, I could see the reflection of massive dark vehicles approaching at a high speed. Jalen opened the front door, throwing it wide open with maximum arrogance, fully prepared to use my long-standing reputation in the neighborhood to intimidate whoever was outside. He puffed his chest out and stepped onto the front porch, completely unaware that the name he was about to weaponize meant absolutely nothing to the ruthless entity pulling into the driveway. 3 massive black corporate SUVs did not bother waiting for the driveway path to clear. They jumped the concrete curb with brutal, calculated precision, rolling aggressively onto the manicured front lawn. Their heavy reinforced tires completely crushed the delicate imported flower beds Madison had forced me to plant and maintain on my hands and knees just last spring. Dark mud and torn bright petals flew into the air as the vehicles formed a tight, impenetrable blockade right across the property line. Madison screamed from the doorway, dropping her phone in pure shock so the camera tilted upward, capturing the chaotic scene from a skewed, frantic angle on the floor. 5 men in sharp, immaculate tailored suits stepped out of the vehicles in perfect unison. They moved with a cold, synchronized corporate efficiency that instantly shattered the flimsy illusion of Jalen's fake wealth. They were not local contractors or angry neighbors coming to complain about the noise. They were the physical manifestation of Apex Holdings arriving to claim their legal property. Flanking the executives were 2 massive private security contractors wearing dark tactical gear and carrying heavy restraints on their belts. The guards immediately took strategic positions at the edge of the property line, establishing an absolute physical perimeter, preventing anyone from leaving or entering. Jalen stood frozen on the porch, his arrogant posture collapsing inward as the lead executive. A man with cold, unblinking eyes walked directly toward him, holding a thick metal clipboard. The corporate takeover had physically arrived right at his doorstep, and my son suddenly realized his fake digital empire was no match for absolute ruthless reality. I sat on my mountain balcony, gripping my glass of iced tea as I watched the scene unfold on the glowing screen of my phone. Madison had dropped her device on the hardwood floor when the vehicles jumped the curb, but the camera angle was perfectly positioned to capture the front doorway and the edge of the lawn. The heavy doors of the 3 black SUVs swung open in perfect unison. Maxwell stepped out of the lead vehicle wearing a charcoal-tailored suit that looked entirely out of place in our working-class neighborhood. He did not yell or act frantic in any way. He moved with a terrifying, calculated calmness. He bypassed the crushed flower beds and walked directly toward the open front door where the demolition crew was still holding their heavy tools. His deep voice carried clearly through the phone's microphone. He ordered the foreman to halt all work immediately. The foreman, a burly man covered in white gypsum dust, stepped forward to protest, but Maxwell simply raised his hand. He announced with absolute corporate authority that the crew was currently executing an unauthorized demolition on private property legally owned by Apex Holdings. He informed them that any further damage to the structural integrity of the house would result in immediate severe civil lawsuits against their unlicensed contracting company. The crew did not hesitate for a single second. The foreman took one look at the 5 suited executives and the armed private security contractors flanking them, and immediately ordered his men to drop their sledgehammers. The loud crashing of the demolition ceased, completely replaced by the heavy, tense silence of a hostile corporate takeover. Jalen stormed out onto the front porch, his face flushed with a furious, entitled rage. I could see the thick veins bulging in his neck through the camera feed. He puffed out his chest, trying to physically intimidate a man who bought and sold entire city blocks before breakfast. Jalen marched down the porch steps and pointed a finger directly at Maxwell's chest. He aggressively demanded to know who Maxwell thought he was, and ordered him to get his corporate vehicles off the lawn immediately. Jalen puffed himself up and desperately tried to weaponize my name. He loudly proclaimed that his father was a highly respected master electrician who had lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and that the entire community would not stand for this kind of disrespect. He threatened to call the police, the mayor, and every lawyer in the city to sue Maxwell for trespassing and massive property damage. It was a pathetic display of borrowed authority. My son had spent his entire adult life alienating the very neighbors he was now trying to use as a protective shield. He was leaning heavily on the reputation he had thrown into a damp basement just days prior. He shouted that he was the rightful heir to the estate and that he was currently running a massive lucrative tech startup inside the home. He threatened to ruin Maxwell's firm with a single phone call. I watched my son desperately cling to his fake millionaire persona, completely unaware that his loud, arrogant threats meant absolutely nothing to a faceless corporate entity that owned the very ground he was standing on. Maxwell did not flinch or back away. He did not engage in a shouting match or attempt to match Jalen's erratic, emotional energy. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal suit and pulled out a crisp, folded document. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and held the paper out calmly. Jalen hesitated for a fraction of a second before snatching the document from Maxwell's hand. Maxwell spoke with a chilling, flat tone that easily carried through the live broadcast. He informed Jalen that the piece of paper was a court-stamped 24-hour notice to vacate. He stated clearly that Apex Holdings had finalized a cash purchase of the property 3 days ago directly from the sole legal deed holder. Maxwell explained that since there was no active lease agreement on file, Jalen and Madison were legally classified as unauthorized occupants. Jalen scanned the document, his eyes darting across the heavy black text and the official county seals. Instead of realizing the absolute gravity of the situation, Jalen let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. He crumpled the official court document in his fist and threw it directly onto the muddy grass right next to Madison's ruined flower beds. He arrogantly told Maxwell that the paper was a fake and that no one could sell the house without his permission because he had a massive line of credit tied directly to the address. Jalen smugly crossed his arms, believing he had just called a massive bluff. He had absolutely no idea he was admitting to his own financial crime on a live internet broadcast. Maxwell looked down at the crumpled legal notice resting in the mud. He did not bend down to pick it up or argue the point. He simply gave a sharp, subtle nod to the massive private security contractors standing at the edge of the property line. The guards moved with synchronized military precision. They marched directly to the heavy wrought iron driveway gates I had installed years ago to keep my family safe. They pulled thick, heavy-duty steel chains and solid brass padlocks from their tactical belts and began wrapping them tightly around the iron bars. The loud metallic clanking echoed loudly through the phone speaker. Jalen spun around, his arrogant smirk vanishing instantly as he realized they were physically barricading his luxury vehicles inside the property. Madison finally moved, coming into the frame as she grabbed her phone from the floor. The camera shook wildly as she shrieked at the guards to stop touching the gates. Maxwell ignored her completely. He pulled a sleek smartphone from his pocket and dialed a number. He spoke clearly and deliberately, reporting a severe ongoing incident to the local sheriff's department. He provided the exact address and stated that hostile illegal squatters were currently destroying corporate property and refusing a lawful order to vacate. He'd requested immediate police intervention to prevent further property damage. Jalen lunged forward in a blind panic, trying to snatch the phone, but the two armed guards instantly stepped between him and Maxwell, placing their hands resting firmly on their belts. The reality of the situation finally slammed into my son. The corporate trap had snapped shut, and the police were already on their way. The piercing wail of approaching sirens echoed clearly through the small speaker of my cell phone. I sat perfectly still on my mountain balcony watching the live broadcast as two local county police cruisers turned sharply onto my old street. Their flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dust still settling over the front lawn. Jalen instantly shifted his entire demeanor. He smoothed the front of his designer shirt, attempting to project the image of a wealthy, outraged homeowner who had just been deeply wronged. He marched down the porch steps, pointing aggressively at Maxwell and his heavily armed security contractors. As the lead officer stepped out of his cruiser, Jalen immediately launched into his polished corporate performance. He used his loudest, most authoritative voice, claiming he was the victim of a hostile home invasion. He gestured wildly toward the crushed flower beds and the heavy chains wrapped around the driveway gates, demanding that the officers arrest Maxwell for criminal trespass and severe property damage. Madison was right behind him, holding her phone up high, crying theatrical tears for her live audience, playing the part of the terrified, defenseless wife. She wailed that these corporate thugs had just rolled onto their private estate unprovoked. The lead officer, an older, heavily built sheriff with graying temples, did not look impressed. He had clearly dealt with every type of domestic dispute and neighborhood squabble in his career. He was completely immune to Jalen. He had clearly dealt with every type of domestic dispute and neighborhood squabble in his career. He was completely immune to Jalen's expensive clothes and loud, frantic demands. Jalen actually reached out to shake the sheriff's hand, attempting to buddy up to law enforcement, but the officer firmly kept his hands resting on his duty belt. The sheriff ignored Jalen's silver tongue and bluntly asked for identification. Jalen eagerly reached into his back pocket and produced his driver's license, holding it up like a golden ticket. He smugly pointed out that his current address perfectly matched the property, assuming this plastic card granted him absolute dominion over the estate. Maxwell stepped forward, moving with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. He did not raise his voice or argue with my son. He simply greeted the sheriff with a calm, professional nod and handed over a thick, water-resistant leather folder. I leaned closer to my phone screen, watching the sheriff open the binding. Inside was the absolute airtight proof of my silent counterstrike. The sheriff carefully reviewed the crisp, notarized deed transfer bearing my authentic signature. He examined the escrow clearance forms, the massive cash wire receipt from Apex Holdings, and the official court-stamped 24-hour notice to vacate. Jalen kept interrupting loudly, insisting that his father was mentally unwell and that the sale was a complete scam. The sheriff completely ignored the noise. He pulled a heavy tactical flashlight from his belt to inspect the undeniable legal seals stamped on the thick paper. He unclipped the radio from his shoulder and contacted his dispatcher, reading out the civil court docket number printed neatly at the top of Maxwell's eviction notice. The radio cracked with static before the dispatcher confirmed that the document was entirely active, legally binding, and fully enforceable by law enforcement. Jalen's frantic attempts to control the narrative were slamming into an immovable wall of corporate documentation. The sheriff closed the leather folder and handed it back to Maxwell with a respectful nod. He turned slowly to face Jalen, his expression hardening into absolute, uncompromising authority. He bluntly informed my son that the address printed on his driver's license meant absolutely nothing. The sheriff stated clearly that the property had been legally and irrevocably sold by the sole deed holder 3 days ago. Jalen physically stumbled backward, his silver tongue finally failing him as the words struck his chest. He stammered, insisting there had to be a massive mistake, shouting that he was the rightful heir and that the house belonged to his family. The sheriff cut him off sharply, his voice booming across the front lawn. He explained that according to the law, Jalen and Madison were currently classified as unauthorized occupants. They possess no active lease agreement, no ownership stake, and absolutely no legal rights to remain inside the structure. Jalen looked around frantically, his eyes darting between the crushed garden, the armed security guards, and the flashing police lights. The neighborhood he thought he ruled was standing on their porches watching him get systematically stripped of his fake kingdom. He was legally a squatter standing on corporate asphalt. The realization washed over him, completely paralyzing his arrogant posture. He had spent weeks demanding I move into a freezing, damp basement, thinking he held all the power. Now a man with a badge was telling him he did not even own the air he was breathing. The absolute collapse of his unearned authority was a masterpiece to witness. The crushing, heavy silence hanging over the front lawn was violently broken by Madison. She pushed her way past Jalen, completely hysterical and completely unaware of the massive legal trap she was about to spring. She screamed at the sheriff, calling him incompetent and insisting that he did not understand their financial reality. She shrieked at the top of her lungs that they could not possibly be evicted because they had a massive $150,000 active line of credit tied directly to the house. She mistakenly believed that blurting out this massive debt proved they had a legitimate financial stake in the property. Jalen turned ashen pale, his entire body freezing in sheer absolute panic. He'd reached out and aggressively grabbed Madison's arm, desperately hissing at her to shut her mouth. But the damage was permanently done. The sheriff slowly turned his head, his eyes narrowing into tight, suspicious slits as he processed her screaming admission. He looked at the clean, unencumbered title resting in Maxwell's hand, and then looked directly back at Jalen's terrified, sweating face. A massive line of credit on a house he did not own, sold with a perfectly clean title by his father. The math pointed directly to a severe, multi-layered federal crime. The sheriff unclipped his radio once again, his demeanor shifting from handling a civil eviction to investigating a major felony. He contacted his dispatch unit, requesting an immediate priority background check and a severe financial fraud flag on Jalen's exact legal name. He read Jalen's driver's license number aloud into the microphone. The trap I had carefully set in Gregory's law office had just violently snapped shut. The heavy static of the police radio crackled sharply through my phone speaker, cutting through the tense silence on the front lawn. The dispatcher responded to the sheriff, confirming that a massive federal fraud flag had just populated under Jalen's social security number. The sheriff slowly unclipped his hand from his duty belt and stepped directly into my son's personal space. He informed Jalen that the only reason he was not placing him in handcuffs right at this very second was because complex financial crimes required a federal warrant to execute a lawful arrest. However, regarding the property dispute, the law was crystal clear. The sheriff delivered his final uncompromising verdict. Jalen and Madison had exactly 24 hours to gather their personal belongings and vacate the premises entirely. He promised them with a cold, hard stare that if he drove past this address tomorrow morning and saw them standing on the grass, they would both be arrested for criminal trespassing and hauled away in the back of his cruiser. He turned his back on my son, signaling the other officers to wrap up the scene. Maxwell did not say a single word. He simply adjusted his charcoal suit, nodded respectfully to the sheriff, and signaled his security contractors to fall back to the perimeter. The police cruisers pulled away down the street, their sirens silenced, leaving behind an eerie, devastating quiet. Jalen and Madison were left standing in the dust of their own arrogance, staring at the heavy chains wrapped tightly around the wrought iron gates. The corporate machine had paused, but the countdown to their absolute physical removal had officially begun. Panic immediately seized the space the moment the authorities drove out of sight. Madison began hyperventilating her hands, pulling violently at her carefully styled hair. She shrieked at Jalen, demanding to know how they were supposed to survive being thrown onto the street like common criminals. Jalen desperately tried to reassemble his shattered alpha male persona. He puffed out his chest, trying to project a false sense of absolute control over a situation that had completely slipped through his fingers. He loudly promised Madison that they did not need my outdated house anyway, and that he would simply rent them a luxury penthouse downtown until he could sue Maxwell's corporation for harassment. He reached into his tailored slacks and pulled out his smartphone, moving with frantic, jerky motions. Through the skewed angle of the dropped camera, I watched his thumbs fly across the screen as he opened his primary banking application. He scanned his face to bypass the security lock, expecting to see the stolen funds he had been flaunting for months. Instead, his confident posture violently collapsed. He froze, completely paralyzed by the image illuminating his face. The screen flashed a stark, aggressive red warning banner. The text was large and completely unforgiving, stating that his accounts were currently frozen due to highly suspicious activity. The safety net he thought he possessed had vanished into thin air, leaving him staring at a digital brick wall. Jalen frantically tapped the screen, trying to force the application to bypass the brutal red warning. He switched to his secondary business accounts, the ones tied to his fake tech startup, but every single digital vault returned the exact same frozen status. He pulled his thick leather wallet from his pocket and desperately attempted to transfer funds using his high-limit platinum credit cards. Every single transaction was instantly declined. The massive financial block was absolute. As he stared at the string of zero balances, the terrifying reality of his situation finally clicked into place. He navigated to the loan portal to check the status of the fraudulent home equity line of credit. The page loaded, displaying a clear green check mark next to the words "paid in full." The breath rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, panicked gasp. He realized in that exact moment that I had not simply run away into the night. I had used my own clean money to quietly pay off the massive lien he forged in my name. He instantly understood that by eliminating the debt so rapidly, I had intentionally tripped the bank's automated algorithmic fraud sensors. The compliance division knew the initial loan documents were completely fake. The federal authorities were already auditing his entire financial history. Jalen stumbled backward, leaning heavily against the brick facade of the house. He possessed exactly $0. He had no access to cash, no viable credit, and absolutely no way to buy his way out of the crushing ruin closing in around him. The loud, tense argument on the porch had not gone unnoticed. The demolition crew foreman, an imposing man covered in white drywall dust, stepped out of the front door. He had stood quietly in the ruined living room, listening to every single word exchanged between the police, the corporate executives, and my son. He walked slowly down the porch steps, stopping right in front of Jalen. He did not bother asking for the double rate Jalen had arrogantly promised him just an hour ago. He bluntly stated that since the accounts were frozen and the house belonged to a corporation, his crew was not going to see a single dime for the demolition work they had already completed. Jalen stammered desperately, promising he would get the cash by tomorrow, but the foreman just shook his head in disgust. He turned around and whistled sharply to his men standing inside the house. The crew moved with immediate, ruthless efficiency. They ignored the rubble and walked straight toward Madison's filming setup. They seized her towering ring lights, her expensive digital cameras, and the heavy designer bags she had left near the hallway console. Another worker approached Jalen and aggressively demanded the luxury designer watch strapped to his wrist. Jalen was too terrified to resist. He unclasped the heavy gold timepiece and handed it over completely stripped of his pride. Madison screamed in pure agony as the workers marched right past her, carrying the tools of her fake influencer lifestyle out the front door. The crew loaded their trucks and drove away, leaving my son and his wife standing in the dirt, absolutely penniless. The heavy rumble of the demolition crew's trucks faded down the street, carrying away the last remnants of Madison's fake digital empire. I sat comfortably on my mountain balcony, watching the entire scene unfold through the skewed angle of the smartphone Madison had dropped on the hardwood floor. The live broadcast was still actively running, streaming their absolute ruin to thousands of confused viewers. The camera captured the dust settling over the jagged hole in the living room wall. Jalen stood perfectly still in the center of the ruined room, staring blankly at his bare wrist, where his heavy gold designer watch used to be. Madison stood a few feet away, staring at the empty space in the hallway where her expensive lighting equipment and luxury bags had been resting just moments ago. The frantic hyperventilating that had consumed her during the police confrontation suddenly stopped. I watched her posture shift as her mind rapidly processed the crushing sequence of events. She pieced together the sheriff's blunt warning about a federal fraud investigation with the undeniable reality of Jalen's frozen bank accounts. The math was incredibly simple and entirely devastating. She realized in that silent, dusty room that her husband was not a brilliant tech entrepreneur on the verge of a massive corporate buyout. He was a desperate broke fraudster who had just been caught red-handed committing a major financial crime against his own father. The illusion of her perfect wealthy lifestyle shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces right in front of her eyes. She stared at Jalen not with the supportive concern of a loving wife, but with the cold, calculating realization of a woman who had backed the wrong horse. The silence in the demolished living room was heavy and suffocating. Jalen finally moved, taking a hesitant step toward Madison. He reached out with his trembling hands, desperately trying to offer some kind of empty comfort. He promised her that it was just a temporary misunderstanding and that his lawyers would fix the banking error by tomorrow morning. Madison slapped his hands away with a violent, vicious force. The mask of the devoted, supportive influencer wife completely evaporated, revealing the ruthless opportunist hiding underneath. She leaned in close to him, her voice dropping into a harsh, venomous hiss that the phone microphone picked up perfectly. She explicitly told him to stop lying to her face. She unleashed a torrent of bitter truth, admitting that she never cared about his pathetic failing tech startup or his boring corporate dreams. She revealed with absolute brutal honesty that the only reason she ever agreed to marry him was because he constantly bragged about his guaranteed inheritance. He had sold her a grand illusion built entirely around my massive, fully paid-off estate. She had endured his insufferable arrogance and stroked his fragile ego for years strictly because she believed she was securing a multi-million-dollar payout. She wanted the house, the land, and the absolute financial security I had spent my entire life building. She aggressively pointed at the court-stamped eviction notice lying in the dirt outside. She told him that there was no inheritance left and no payout waiting for her. There was only a massive federal indictment closing in on a man who owned absolutely nothing. Jalen physically shrank under the sheer force of her verbal assault. His broad shoulders caved inward and his fake alpha male persona completely disintegrated. He had spent years parading around my house giving orders and acting like a supreme commander, but without stolen money propping him up, he was nothing more than a terrified little boy. Madison mercilessly tore into his masculinity. She mocked his total incompetence, laughing bitterly at the fact that he could not even successfully steal from a 70-year-old retired electrician. She hurled insults like heavy stones, calling him a pathetic failure who had gotten effortlessly outsmarted by his own elderly father. She stated that he lacked the intelligence to execute a simple fraud and that his sheer stupidity had dragged her into a massive legal nightmare. Jalen completely broke down. The man who had arrogantly thrown a $20 bill at me and ordered me to sleep in a damp basement fell to his knees in the drywall dust. He openly wept, begging Madison not to abandon him when he needed her most. He clutched at the hem of her designer pants, pleading for another chance. He frantically promised that he would track me down no matter where I had gone. He swore on his life that he would find my new location and physically force me to write a check to reverse the corporate sale and fix this massive mess. It was an absolutely pathetic display of weakness, showcasing the true depth of his cowardice. He was still relying on the delusion that he could bully me into saving him from his own disastrous choices. Madison looked down at her husband groveling in the dirt and let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It was a cold, heartless sound that echoed loudly through the empty house. She told Jalen he was utterly delusional if he believed the old man who had just orchestrated this flawless corporate trap would ever hand him another single dime. She stepped away from him, pulling her backup smartphone from her pocket. She rapidly navigated to a ride-sharing application, ordering an exclusive black car service to rescue her from the disaster zone. She paid for the luxury ride using a private emergency credit card she had kept entirely hidden from Jalen, protecting her own exit strategy. She ignored his desperate weeping and walked briskly through the house, gathering the few remaining personal items and designer coats the demolition crew had failed to seize. She stuffed them haphazardly into a small canvas tote bag. Jalen scrambled to his feet, following her like a lost dog, begging her to stay and figure out a legal defense with him. The sleek black vehicle pulled up to the curb, parking right behind the heavy chains locking the driveway gates. Madison walked out the front door, stepping carefully over the crushed flower beds in her expensive shoes. She reached the edge of the property and turned back to face Jalen, who was standing in the doorway covered in white dust and tears. She looked him up and down with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. She delivered her final crushing blow with a steady, unfeeling voice. "You are a loser, Jalen. Have fun in jail." She turned her back, opened the car door, and rode away, leaving my son completely alone in the ruins of his stolen kingdom. The black vehicle carrying Madison disappeared around the corner, leaving my son completely alone in the dust of his shattered reality. I watched him sink to his knees on the ruined floorboards of the living room through the live feed that was still broadcasting his misery to the world. I eventually turned off my phone and went to sleep in my quiet mountain apartment. When the sun rose the next morning, the 24-hour grace period granted by the county sheriff officially expired. I woke up to the sound of a red-tailed hawk calling in the distance. The air was crisp and entirely pure. I brewed a strong pot of black coffee sitting on my balcony while opening the security application on my tablet. I had discreetly installed a small camera on the exterior of my old house weeks ago. Right on the dot at 8 in the morning, the street filled with the heavy rumble of diesel engines. Maxwell did not come to negotiate. He arrived in his lead corporate vehicle, followed immediately by 2 county sheriff cruisers and a massive industrial moving truck. A crew of 10 burly men wearing matching gray uniforms stepped out of the truck, moving with cold mechanical efficiency. They carried heavy-duty dollies, thick plastic wrapping, and large cardboard boxes. They were the cleanup crew for Apex Holdings, specifically hired to clear out unwanted debris. Maxwell stood on the sidewalk, with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at my former home with the detached gaze of a man evaluating a construction site. The lead sheriff walked up the driveway and pounded his heavy fist against the front door. The sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood, a harsh final warning that time had completely run out. The front door slowly creaked open, revealing Jalen. He looked absolutely hollow. He was still wearing the same dust-covered clothes from the day before, his face unshaven and his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night of panic. The sheriff did not offer a single word of sympathy. He bluntly informed Jalen that the eviction order was now fully active and instructed him to step aside. Jalen stood frozen in the doorway, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his failure. He weakly mumbled that he needed more time to contact his lawyer, but his voice lacked any trace of his former arrogance. The sheriff placed a firm hand on my son's shoulder and physically escorted him out of the house, guiding him down the porch steps and onto the front lawn. The moment the path was clear, Maxwell signaled the moving crew. They flooded into the house like a swarm of locusts. I watched through the camera feed as they began dismantling Jalen's life with absolute ruthlessness. 2 men carried out his custom-imported luxury mattress, dragging it carelessly across the concrete driveway. Others hauled out his massive flat-screen televisions, broken electronics, and expensive designer clothes, tossing them into a disorganized pile on the edge of the street. They did not treat his expensive suits with any reverence. Silk shirts and tailored jackets were shoved into coarse plastic bags and thrown onto the wet grass. The luxury he had bled my home equity dry to acquire was treated like common yard waste. Jalen stood on the grass, watching the physical evidence of his fake millionaire lifestyle being thrown out of the house he had tried to steal. He was entirely powerless to stop the corporate machine from erasing his presence. The sky above the city had been turning a bruised, heavy gray all morning, and the inevitable finally happened. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the neighborhood, followed by a sudden freezing downpour. The rain fell in thick, heavy sheets, soaking the manicured lawns and pooling in the streets. Jalen did not seek shelter. He walked slowly toward the curb and sat down right next to his pile of discarded belongings. The cold rain soaked through his expensive designer shirt, plastering it to his skin. I watched him sitting there shivering in the mud, and a vivid memory flashed through my mind. I remembered a Thanksgiving dinner a few years ago when Jalen openly mocked my worn work boots and my faded flannel shirts. He had laughed and told his friends that I lacked the vision to understand true wealth. He called my disciplined, frugal lifestyle pathetic compared to his fast-paced, modern hustle. I thought my calloused hands were a sign of failure. He had spent his entire life running away from the reality of hard work, relying on shortcuts and manipulation to build a hollow monument to himself. Now the boy who thought he was a king was sitting on a wet curb with less than nothing. His digital empire was a fraud, and his physical world was reduced to a pile of wet clothes. While he sat in the freezing rain, Maxwell's crew brought out heavy sheets of plywood and cordless drills. They systematically covered the beautiful bay windows of the master bedroom and sealed the front door shut. The loud screech of the drills echoed through the storm as they boarded up the house, ensuring that no one would ever step foot inside that property again. The humiliation was already absolute, but the universe had one final brutal lesson to deliver to my son. As the moving crew finished boarding up the last window, a heavy yellow tow truck turned onto the street, splashing water against the curb. The flashing amber lights cut through the gray storm as the driver backed the massive truck directly toward Jalen's prized possession. It was the sleek luxury Mercedes sedan he loved to flaunt, parked right there in the driveway. The bank had not just frozen his checking accounts. The fraud alert had immediately flagged all his active lines of credit, including the massive delinquent auto loan he had been ignoring for months. The tow truck driver hopped out of the cab, ignoring the rain, and swiftly attached heavy steel chains to the front axle of the vehicle. Jalen scrambled to his feet, slipping in the wet mud as he ran toward the driver. He frantically waved his hands, shouting over the pouring rain that he just needed one more day to make the payment. But the driver completely ignored him, operating the hydraulic winch with practiced indifference. The mechanical whine of the winch lifting the luxury car into the air was the final nail in the coffin. He was completely exposed, stripped of his fake alpha male persona, and forced to stand under the heavy gaze of the community he had alienated. I watched through this camera as the neighbors, the very people Jalen had looked down upon for years, stood on their covered porches holding cups of morning coffee. They watched in total silence as the tow truck hauled the Mercedes down the street, leaving my son standing in the pouring rain with absolutely nothing left to his name. The trap had closed perfectly, leaving him entirely destitute and desperate for a lifeline that no longer existed. I did not need to be physically present in the city to know exactly how my son's first day on the streets played out. I had spent 40 years building a deep, unbreakable network of friends, colleagues, and neighbors. My phone buzzed steadily on my mountain balcony, bringing me real-time updates of Jalen's absolute downfall. Left entirely alone after the tow truck hauled away his leased Mercedes, Jalen was forced to do something he considered entirely beneath his fake millionaire status. He had to walk. He dragged his heavy designer suitcase down the wet, cracked sidewalks of the neighborhood he had spent his entire adult life mocking. The small plastic wheels of his expensive luggage ground harshly against the wet asphalt, loudly announcing his pathetic walk of shame to the entire community. The storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, biting wind that cut right through his thin silk shirt. He trudged past the modest homes of the working-class families he had actively alienated. People stood on their porches holding their morning coffee, watching in absolute silence as the arrogant boy who had tried to throw his own father into a damp basement was publicly humbled. Jalen kept his head down, his expensive leather shoes completely ruined by the deep, muddy puddles pooling in the street. He had absolutely no cash to call a cab and no friends willing to answer his desperate text messages. The fake network of influencers and wealthy tech entrepreneurs he had courted for years completely evaporated the second his bank accounts froze. He was a man without a country, wandering aimlessly through a reality he had brutally created for himself. Desperation has a funny way of making a man revisit the very places he previously despised. With nowhere else to go, Jalen dragged his suitcase up the heavy stone steps of the community church I had attended every single Sunday for the last 3 decades. He had relentlessly mocked my faith, calling my dedication to the congregation an outdated waste of time for weak-minded people. Now he was standing at the heavy oak doors, hoping to manipulate that exact same faith to secure a warm bed. He managed to track down the head pastor in the fellowship hall. Jalen immediately launched into a frantic theatrical performance. He produced fake tears, sobbing about how a ruthless corporation had stolen his home and how Madison had cruelly abandoned him. He begged the pastor for temporary shelter in the church basement and aggressively demanded my new contact information, claiming he needed to make sure his elderly father was safe. The pastor, an observant man who had counseled me through Cynthia's passing, did not offer a single word of comfort. He looked at Jalen with a profound, unwavering disappointment. The pastor calmly informed my son that the entire congregation already knew exactly how he had treated me. He knew about the ultimatum at the dinner table and the garbage bags filled with my wife's belongings. The pastor stepped back and gripped the heavy brass handle of the church door. He looked Jalen in the eye and stated that a man who evicts his own father from his sanctuary will find no sanctuary in the house of the Lord. The heavy oak door slammed shut, leaving Jalen shivering on the cold stone steps. Completely out of options, Jalen made one final pathetic attempt to secure a lifeline. He dragged his muddy suitcase 2 miles across town to the local electrical workers' union hall. I had spent 40 years in that hall, paying my dues, mentoring young apprentices, and building a rock-solid reputation, built on sweat and absolute integrity. Jalen had always sneered at my union brothers, calling them uneducated manual laborers who lacked his superior corporate vision. Now he was walking into their domain, reeking of wet silk and total desperation. He pushed through the glass doors of the bustling break room, interrupting a dozen seasoned electricians having their lunch. He frantically scanned the room, looking for anyone who might slip him a few $20 bills or reveal the location of my new mountain apartment. He begged for help, trying to leverage my name and my legacy to save his own skin. An old foreman who had worked directly alongside me for over 30 years slowly stood up from his table. He was a massive, imposing man with hands just as calloused and scarred as mine. He walked right up to Jalen, towering over his shrinking frame. The foreman did not raise his voice, but his words cut through the room like a sharp steel blade. He told Jalen that a man earns his community through respect and sacrifice, not through theft and arrogance. The foreman looked down at my shivering son and delivered a cold, undeniable truth. You spit on the roots, do not cry when the tree falls on you. He pointed a thick, scarred finger directly toward the exit, commanding Jalen to leave the building immediately before the men physically threw him out. Jalen was shoved back out onto the unforgiving city pavement, his suitcase handle slipping from his numb, freezing fingers. He had been universally rejected by the church, the community, and the working-class men he had spent his life stepping on. He dragged himself over to a bus stop bench, collapsing onto the cold metal slats. His hands shook violently as he pulled his smartphone from his wet pocket. The battery icon was flashing a critical red warning, indicating he had less than 5% power remaining. He desperately opened his email, hoping to find a message from Madison or a miraculous notification that his bank accounts had been unfrozen. Instead, a new message popped into his inbox carrying a highly secure encrypted tag. The sender was the absolute highest tier of the legal compliance division at his primary financial institution. Jalen opened the email, his blood running completely cold. It was a formal digital subpoena. The bank had officially escalated the investigation regarding the fraudulent $150,000 home equity line of credit. The document formally mandated his immediate appearance at a federal deposition regarding charges of aggravated wire fraud and felony identity theft. The automated system had detected the forged digital proxies he used to steal my equity. The message explicitly stated that failure to secure immediate legal counsel would result in an active federal arrest warrant. Jalen stared at the dying screen as the terrifying reality crushed the last remaining breath out of his lungs. He had no money to hire a defense attorney, and his phone screen faded to pitch black. He was completely out of time, and his only remaining option was to face the lawyer who orchestrated his ruin. Jalen pushed through the heavy glass doors of Gregory Vance's downtown law firm, leaving a trail of muddy footprints across the pristine marble lobby. The receptionist tried to stop him, but he aggressively shoved past her desk, marching directly toward the corner office. He threw open the heavy oak door without knocking. Gregory was sitting behind his immaculate desk, reviewing a legal brief. Jalen stood there shivering in his ruined designer clothes, looking absolutely pathetic, but still desperately clinging to his fake alpha male persona. He slammed his dirty hands down onto the polished wood, demanding answers. He raised his voice, shouting that he knew Gregory had orchestrated the illegal sale of his home. Jalen puffed out his chest and falsely claimed he had already spoken to a team of aggressive corporate litigators. He demanded my exact current address and arrogantly stated he was filing a massive civil lawsuit against the estate to claim his rightful half of the $800,000 house sale. He threatened to have Gregory disbarred for elder abuse, insisting that his father was mentally incompetent and that the entire real estate transaction was a massive criminal conspiracy. It was a spectacular display of delusional bluffing. It was a broke homeless man with a dead cell phone trying to intimidate one of the most ruthless and respected attorneys in the city. Gregory did not call security or raise his voice. He had known Jalen since the day I brought him home from the hospital as an infant. Gregory had watched this boy grow up rejecting every single value his hardworking parents tried to instill in him. There was absolutely zero pity in the older attorney's eyes, only a profound, cold disgust. Gregory slowly closed the file he was reading and folded his hands, resting them on the desk. He calmly reached into his side drawer and pulled out a thick, heavily tabbed legal folder. He slid it across the smooth mahogany surface until it bumped directly against Jalen's muddy fingertips. He instructed my son to open it. Jalen hesitated, his arrogant facade slipping as he flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. The first page was a printed log of the digital proxy signatures used to secure the fraudulent home equity line of credit. The second page contained the IP address tracking data, pinpointing the exact location where the fake documents were generated. The third page was the official banking receipt showing my massive $150,000 cash transfer that completely paid off the stolen debt. Gregory spoke with surgical precision. He systematically dismantled Jalen's bluff, detailing exactly how the federal wire fraud and felony identity theft charges would be prosecuted. I made it crystal clear that I had not stolen a single dime. I had used my own retirement savings to buy back the title Jalen had illegally encumbered. The realization hit Jalen like a physical blow to the stomach. Gregory knew absolutely everything, and the airtight evidence was resting right there on the desk. Jalen staggered backward, his legs trembling, as the threat of federal prison completely crushed his false bravado. His aggressive posture melted into sheer panic. He began stammering out pathetic excuses, blaming Madison for manipulating him into taking out the loans. He switched tactics, instantly begging Gregory to act as a mediator. He pleaded for access to my bank accounts, claiming that as the only living heir, he was legally entitled to an early inheritance to secure a criminal defense attorney. Gregory let out a sharp, humorless laugh that cut through the quiet office. He reached into the same drawer and pulled out a single sheet of heavy bonded legal paper. It was a fully executed notarized document bearing my signature and an official court seal. Gregory handed it to Jalen, informing him that it was a legally binding, irrevocable disinheritance clause. The document explicitly detailed that my entire remaining fortune, including the offshore funds from the house sale and all liquid assets, were permanently locked in a blind trust. Upon my passing, every single dollar would be immediately transferred to a trade school scholarship fund designed specifically to train young, underprivileged black men in the art of master carpentry. I was leaving my legacy to young men who actually wanted to build a life with their hands, honoring the sacrifices Cynthia and I had made. Jalen stared at the document, his eyes wide with absolute horror. The legal text clearly stated that he was completely disinherited. He was legally entitled to absolutely nothing. The wealth he had built his entire fake identity around was permanently out of his reach. The crushing weight of total financial and legal ruin brought Jalen to his knees. He gripped the edge of Gregory's desk, breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. Gregory checked the gold watch strapped to his wrist and delivered the final devastating blow. He informed Jalen that the Bank Compliance Division had already finalized their internal audit regarding the forged loan documents. Gregory explicitly stated that Jalen had exactly 48 hours before the lending institution formally handed the evidence over to the district attorney to execute a federal arrest warrant. Jalen had 2 days of freedom remaining before the authorities dragged him into a concrete cell. As my son knelt there, paralyzed by the ticking countdown, his desperate eyes darted wildly across the surface of the mahogany desk, looking for any possible lifeline. He noticed a small yellow shipping courier receipt resting near Gregory's keyboard. The slip documented the delivery of the finalized real estate contracts. Jalen locked his eyes onto the return address printed clearly in bold black ink. It read Blue Ridge Mountains, North Carolina. The geographic location instantly burned itself into his panicked mind. He realized that this was where I had escaped to. A desperate, twisted spark of manipulation ignited in his brain. He firmly believed that if he could just get to me in person, he could fake enough tears to manipulate my paternal instincts and force me to pay for his legal defense. Jalen suddenly scrambled to his feet, dropping the disinheritance document onto the floor. He did not say another word to Gregory. He turned around and bolted out of the office, running frantically toward the street to hunt down his final remaining target. Gregory called me the exact second my son bolted from the downtown law firm in a blind panic. My old friend warned me that Jalen had locked his desperate eyes onto the shipping receipt bearing my North Carolina location. I did not panic or rush to lock my doors. I simply brewed a fresh pot of coffee and waited for the inevitable collision. I knew exactly how a man like Jalen operated when completely cornered by his own disastrous consequences. He had no access to his frozen bank accounts, and his credit cards were entirely useless pieces of plastic. To cross state lines and hunt me down, he was forced to endure an experience he considered absolutely beneath his fake millionaire status. He later confessed the pathetic details of his journey to me, though he framed it as a desperate plea for my sympathy rather than an admission of his own failure. Jalen walked through the pouring rain into a dingy, dimly lit pawn shop on the edge of the city limits. He stripped off his custom-tailored Italian wool jacket, the exact same luxury jacket he was wearing the night he arrogantly ordered me to sleep in a damp basement. The pawnbroker took one look at his frantic, sweating face and offered him mere pennies on the dollar. Jalen accepted a single $50 bill. It was just enough cash to purchase a one-way ticket on a cramped overnight Greyhound bus leaving the city. The man who had spent the last 3 years bragging about building a massive corporate empire was now sitting in the gritty, echoing bus terminal, clutching a cheap paper ticket surrounded by the very working-class struggles he had spent his entire adult life mercilessly mocking. As the heavy diesel engine of the bus carried him hundreds of miles south toward the rugged terrain of the Blue Ridge Mountains, Jalen did not use the agonizing hours to reflect on his staggering betrayals. He did not look out the rain-streaked window and feel an ounce of genuine remorse for forging my signature on a massive loan or for watching Madison throw my late wife's cherished belongings into garbage bags. Instead, he spent the entire grueling journey drafting a masterful theatrical performance. He sat in the cramped, narrow back row, rehearsing the precise pitch and tone of his fake tears. He planned to throw himself at my feet and play the ultimate innocent victim. He meticulously crafted a narrative that blamed absolutely everything on Madison, claiming that her insatiable greed and toxic social media obsessions had clouded his judgment and forced his hand. He intended to sob about the crushing, relentless pressure of his failing tech startup, attempting to weaponize my lifelong instinct to protect and provide for my family. His ultimate goal was to manipulate my deep paternal love into writing a massive blank check to secure a high-powered federal defense attorney to beat his impending wire fraud indictment. He firmly believed that my 40 years of unconditional sacrifice and quiet stoicism meant I was fundamentally soft and easily broken. I thought he could simply push the right emotional buttons, and I would automatically revert to the shield that had protected him his entire life. Jalen arrived in the small, picturesque mountain town just as the late afternoon shadows began stretching long and dark across the valley. He was completely exhausted, covered in dried city mud and smelling heavily of diesel fumes and pure desperation. He managed to track down the upscale gated community where my new luxury apartment complex was located. Driven by his towering, unearned ego, he marched right up to the main security checkpoint, fully intending to fast-talk his way past the front gate using his polished corporate charm. The uniformed security guard did not even open the glass window to listen to his lies. The guard simply tapped the reinforced glass booth and pointed to a printed photograph of Jalen's face attached to a strict zero-tolerance do-not-admit order that I had filed the day I moved in. Denied entry through the front door, my son refused to accept his defeat. He circled the heavily wooded perimeter of the complex, looking for a weak point in the absolute defense. He eventually found a steep, muddy embankment leading up the backside of the mountain ridge directly behind my building. Driven by sheer panic and the loud ticking clock of his looming federal arrest warrant, he scrambled up the treacherous incline like a desperate trespassing thief. The sharp, jagged rocks and thick, wet clay completely shredded his expensive leather loafers, leaving his feet bruised and bleeding. He clawed his way over the iron retaining wall, breaching the private grounds and dragging his exhausted, ruined body into the perfectly manicured landscaping of my new sanctuary. I had spent the entire afternoon reading a thick, hardbound book on Stoic philosophy, sitting quietly in the communal scenic overlook that bordered my specific apartment wing. The overlook featured a wide stone patio offering a completely unobstructed, breathtaking view of the majestic mountain peaks. The complex security team had already sent a silent alert to my phone the exact moment Jalen was turned away at the front gate. I knew he was physically trespassing on the property long before I heard the ragged, heavy sound of his breathing echoing from the shadows of the nearby pine trees. He crept carefully along the stone pathway, hiding behind the decorative foliage, waiting for the perfect dramatic moment to launch his rehearsed emotional ambush. He was hiding in the dark, waiting for me to look vulnerable or nostalgic so he could strike. I closed my book and stood up from my wooden bench holding a steaming cup of dark roasted coffee. I did not retreat inside my apartment and lock the doors. I did not call the armed guards to drag him away immediately. I stepped out to the absolute edge of the stone overlook, feeling the crisp, chilling mountain wind brush against my face. I turned my head slowly and looked directly into the dark cluster of trees where my son was crouching like a frightened, cornered animal. I looked at his ruined, filthy clothes, his mud-caked face, and his violently shivering frame. I did not show a single ounce of surprise, fear, or paternal pity. Our eyes locked in the fading mountain light, and the stage for his absolute final destruction was firmly set. Jalen crawled out from behind the thick evergreen shrubs looking absolutely pathetic. His custom-tailored Italian wool trousers were torn at the knees and heavily caked in wet red Appalachian clay. His expensive leather loafers were completely ruined by the sharp rocks of the embankment he had just scrambled up. He did not possess an ounce of the fake alpha male bravado he had paraded around my dining room just weeks ago. Seeing that I was already watching him, he immediately launched into the theatrical performance he had undoubtedly been rehearsing for the entire bus ride from the city. He stumbled forward onto the smooth flagstones of the scenic overlook and violently threw himself to his knees right at my feet. He buried his face in his filthy hands and began to produce loud, racking sobs that echoed awkwardly against the quiet mountain ridge. He wailed that he was deeply sorry, pouring out a frantic, desperate stream of calculated apologies. He aggressively shifted every ounce of blame onto Madison. He wept loudly, claiming that her insatiable toxic greed and relentless obsession with her social media image had completely clouded his judgment. He painted himself as a helpless victim of his own marriage, stating that she had practically forced him to take out those loans to maintain the lifestyle she demanded. He sobbed about the crushing, relentless pressure of the modern corporate world and how his failing tech startup had driven him into a corner. He grabbed at the hem of my jacket, begging me to tap into my offshore accounts and hire a high-powered federal defense attorney to keep him out of a concrete prison cell. He pleaded with me to remember that he was my only child, hoping to weaponize my lifelong instinct to protect him. I did not reach down to pull him up from the cold stone patio. I did not offer a single word of paternal comfort or reassurance. I simply stood there, planted firmly on the edge of the mountain overlook, and let him perform his entire rehearsed monologue without a single interruption. I allowed the sheer pathetic weight of his manipulation to hang entirely unsupported in the freezing evening air. When he finally ran out of breath and his fake sobbing tapered off into dramatic, heavy gasps, the silence that followed was absolutely deafening. The only sounds remaining were the rustle of the wind sweeping through the ancient pine trees and the distant rush of a mountain stream in the valley far below. Jalen stayed on his knees, looking up at me through his fingers, waiting for the familiar warmth of my forgiveness. I was waiting for the soft, compliant father who had spent 4 decades solving every single one of his problems to magically reappear and absorb the impact of his catastrophic choices. I offered him absolutely nothing. I looked down at his muddy, ruined clothes and the desperate, calculating glint in his eyes. I slowly raised my ceramic mug to my lips and took a long, deliberate sip of my dark roasted coffee. The rich, bitter warmth slid down my throat, a sharp, grounding contrast to the freezing wind whipping across the balcony. The psychological weight of my absolute, unyielding silence began to physically crush him. He realized with terrifying clarity that the emotional buttons he had pressed successfully his entire life were entirely disconnected. I was staring at him not as a father viewing a wayward son, but as a man observing a stranger who had tried to steal his sanctuary. I lowered my coffee mug, holding it loosely in my calloused hand. I spoke with a quiet, chilling authority that carried perfectly over the howling mountain wind. I told him he had given me a strict, uncompromising ultimatum at my own dining room table. I reminded him that he had arrogantly ordered me to surrender the bedroom I had shared with my late wife or pack my bags and leave my own property. I looked him dead in the eye and stated that I had simply chosen the option. He lacked the intelligence to anticipate. I reached into the interior pocket of my heavy winter coat and pulled out a neatly folded stack of documents. I let the papers drop from my hand, watching them flutter down to the flagstones, landing directly on the tips of his ruined leather shoes. It was a printed copy of the bank's internal fraud report, identifying the exact digital proxies he had used to forge my signature on the $150,000 home equity line of credit. I explained the mechanics of his destruction with the clinical detachment of an engineer inspecting a burned-out circuit. I detailed exactly how I had used my own clean retirement funds to pay off his fraudulent debt in one massive lump sum. I told him how that sudden payment had cleared the title for my corporate buyer, while simultaneously triggering the automated federal audit that froze his banking accounts. I wanted him to understand that his downfall was not a stroke of bad luck or a mistake by a loan officer. It was a flawless, deliberate counterstrike orchestrated entirely by the old man he had attempted to banish to a damp basement. Jalen stared at the federal fraud report resting in the mud between his knees. The realization that I was the architect of his total financial and legal ruin hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The pathetic fake tears vanished from his face in an absolute instant. The mask of the remorseful broken son completely dissolved, entirely replaced by the vicious, arrogant monster I had faced in my hallway. He scrambled to his feet, his face contorted in an ugly, enraged snarl. He lunged forward, aggressively calling me a traitor and screaming that I was a terrible, selfish father for destroying his life over a simple business loan. He shrieked that I owed him my protection and that my money belonged to his future. I did not flinch or take a single step backward. I squared my shoulders and stepped directly into his personal space. I was 70 years old, but my frame was built by 4 decades of hauling heavy industrial equipment and pulling thick copper wire. My physical presence immediately dominated his shrinking, trembling posture. I stared him down until the false bravado entirely evaporated, and he physically cowered back toward the edge of the stone patio. I set my final absolute boundary. I lowered my voice to a dangerous, steady gravel. I told him I gave him life, and I gave him a safe, pristine home. I stated clearly that he had actively chosen to be a thief, a fraud, and a coward. I informed him that my obligations to him ended the exact moment he forged my name. I stepped back and delivered the final crushing truth. Your consequences belong entirely to you. I raised my right hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the uniformed security guard who had been silently observing the entire confrontation from the deep shadows of the main clubhouse. The guard immediately unclipped the radio from his shoulder harness and signaled for immediate backup. 2 massive, heavily built private security contractors materialized from the winding stone pathway, marching directly onto the scenic overlook with aggressive military precision. Jalen realized in that exact agonizing second that his grand theatrical manipulation had completely and utterly failed. His fake sobbing instantly vanished. He scrambled desperately to his feet, wildly pointing his trembling finger at my chest and screaming that I was making the biggest mistake of my entire life. He shouted at the top of his lungs that he would ruin my reputation and that I would die completely alone on this freezing mountain. The guards did not give him the professional courtesy of a verbal warning. They stepped forward and grabbed him firmly by both arms, lifting him almost completely off his ruined, bleeding feet. Jalen began to thrash violently, kicking his legs and trying to break free from their iron grip, but his soft, unconditioned muscles were absolutely no match for the seasoned contractors. As they physically dragged him away from the stone patio, his aggressive, enraged threats rapidly dissolved back into high-pitched, pathetic wails. He begged me to call the guards off, crying out that he had no money, no phone battery, and nowhere to seek shelter. I did not move a single muscle to intervene. I stood perfectly still with my hands resting deep inside the pockets of my heavy winter coat, listening to his cracking voice echo off the steep canyon walls. I watched the guards march him down the treacherous, winding asphalt road leading far away from the safety of the gated community. He looked incredibly small and insignificant, stumbling through the thick mountain mud in his shredded Italian trousers, completely stripped of his unearned corporate power. As his desperate cries finally faded into the rushing sound of the mountain wind, I simply turned my back. I walked away from the overlook and stepped back into my warm, quiet apartment without looking over my shoulder a single time. The absolute boundary was permanently set. 3 months passed since that defining afternoon on the mountain, and the universe naturally balanced its own scales with ruthless efficiency. I received brief factual updates through Gregory, but I never actively sought them out. Jalen was currently sitting in a cold, windowless county holding cell, wearing a coarse standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The Bank Compliance Division had kept their absolute promise. They forwarded the airtight forensic dossier containing his forged digital proxies and fraudulent loan applications directly to the federal prosecutor. Armed federal marshals had arrested my son at a cheap roadside motel where he had been sleeping on a stained mattress. Because he posed a severe flight risk and possessed absolutely zero verifiable financial assets, the presiding judge firmly denied him bail. I was permanently trapped behind thick iron bars, awaiting a criminal trial that would inevitably result in a decade-long federal prison sentence. He was completely abandoned by the fake, luxurious world he had so deeply worshipped. Madison had immediately filed for a ruthless, expedited divorce, legally severing all ties to his name, to protect her own fragile influencer brand from the toxic fallout of his federal indictment. His wealthy tech entrepreneur friends completely blocked his phone number the very moment the embezzlement scandal hit the local news networks. Jalen spent 23 hours a day locked in a damp concrete cell, sweeping the gray floor with a short plastic broom. He was finally experiencing the exact miserable isolation and degrading physical environment he had so arrogantly designed for me when he ordered me into that freezing basement. Hein had nobody left to emotionally manipulate, and absolutely nothing left to steal. He was a man forced to sit in the deafening silence of his own disastrous consequences, with no escape from the reality of his failure. While my son navigated the brutal, unforgiving reality of the criminal justice system, I was experiencing a profound, glorious rebirth. The crisp, unpolluted air of the Blue Ridge Mountains acted like a daily medicine for my aging lungs and my battered spirit. I was 70 years old, but I woke up every single morning feeling decades younger. The heavy, grinding physical stress that had settled deep in my joints during those suffocating years, living under Jalen's toxic roof, completely vanished. I did not spend my hard-earned retirement sitting idle in a rocking chair waiting for time to pass. I found a local community youth center in the valley that desperately needed reliable volunteers to help keep at risk teenagers off the unforgiving streets. I walked through their doors and offered my 40 years of master electrical and carpentry experience. I spent my afternoons in a large sunlit workshop, teaching young men how to measure wood properly, how to safely wire a basic circuit, and how to build something permanent and beautiful with their own two hands. They called me Mr. Rubin, showing me a level of genuine respect and wide-eyed admiration that my own flesh and blood had never bothered to offer. I was actively building a brand new legacy, sharing the essential trade skills that had kept food on my table my entire life. I made real, authentic friends in the mountain community, encountering honest, hardworking people who valued my character and my quiet integrity over the balance of my bank account. We shared modest dinners on wooden porches and told stories without ever trying to impress one another with fake achievements. I had successfully replaced the constant grinding anxiety of my past with a deep, unshakable sense of daily purpose. I was finally thriving in a life built entirely on my own terms, completely free from the burden of ungrateful expectations. I woke up early on a brisk Tuesday morning, stepping out onto my wide stone balcony with a freshly brewed cup of dark roast coffee resting in my hand. The vast mountain valley far below was blanketed in a thick rolling ocean of white morning mist. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing, letting the deep, profound silence of the high elevation wash completely over my soul. The eastern horizon began to glow with vibrant, intense streaks of gold and deep purple as the morning sun slowly crested the ancient, jagged peaks, chasing away the final, lingering shadows of the night. I took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the cold, pure mountain air fill my chest and energize my blood. In that perfect, quiet moment, the memory of my late wife Cynthia washed over me like a gentle, comforting breeze. It was not a heavy memory of grief or profound loss, but a warm, encouraging presence. I could almost hear her soft, steady voice echoing clearly in my mind, whispering the exact words I needed to hear to fully close this chapter of my life. She told me to protect my peace because I had earned every single second of it through my decades of unwavering sacrifice. She was absolutely right. I had honored her memory not by clinging stubbornly to a house made of decaying wood and brick, but by refusing to let a cowardly thief trample on the honorable life we had built together. The silent adjustment I had meticulously orchestrated was entirely complete. The toxic parasitic element had been surgically removed from my universe, leaving nothing but absolute brilliant clarity behind. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee, watching the golden morning light illuminate the vast, endless beauty of the mountain range, stretching out endlessly before me. My heart beat with a steady, peaceful rhythm unburdened by the past. I was finally completely free. The golden light of the mountain sunrise spilled across the wooden floorboards, warming the crisp morning air. I sat watching the mist roll over the ancient peaks and realized the greatest trap a father builds is constructed out of love. For 40 years, I believed my primary duty as a man was to serve as an impenetrable shield for my family. I grew up in an era where the world was actively hostile toward young black men. I fought for my union card, enduring systemic roadblocks on construction sites just to prove I belonged there. Every drop of sweat I shed and every callus I developed was a deliberate payment made, so my son would never have to experience that same brutal friction. I built a fortress of financial security around Jalen, insulating him from the harsh realities of poverty and struggle. I eliminated our mortgage to guarantee he would always have a roof over his head. But as I watched the hawk circle the valley below me, I finally understood the tragic flaw in my design. By removing every single obstacle from his path, I had accidentally removed his opportunity to build character. A man cannot stand strong if he has never been forced to carry his own weight. I had mistaken enabling for providing. I thought I was protecting him from the wolves outside our door, but I had unknowingly bred a predator inside the very sanctuary I was trying to secure. Love without strict boundaries easily mutates into entitlement. When you hand a man a kingdom, he did not bleed, for he will eventually view the crown as his absolute birthright and the king as a mere inconvenience. This brings me to the most difficult lesson I had to accept during this entire ordeal. Sacrifice is completely meaningless if it is poured into a vessel that refuses to hold it. For years I watched Jalen and Madison operate under the delusion that my silence was a form of weakness. They looked at my faded work jeans and my 10-year-old truck and decided I was an obsolete relic. They failed to realize that true wealth does not scream for attention on social media. True wealth sits quietly in fully funded retirement accounts and unencumbered property deeds. When Jalen forged my signature to secure that massive fraudulent line of credit, he did not just steal money. He attempted to steal the 35 years of grueling labor Cynthia and I had endured. He looked at the home where his mother took her final breath and saw nothing but an automated teller machine waiting to be drained. The hardest truth any parent must face is acknowledging when their child has become a parasite. Society conditions us to believe that family loyalty is an unbreakable, absolute bond. We are told to forgive, to compromise, and to always keep the door open no matter how much poison floods into our homes. That is a dangerous, destructive lie. Loyalty must be earned, and it must be reciprocal. When someone you love looks you in the eye and demands your physical displacement to accommodate their towering ego, the biological connection instantly loses its value. I realized that keeping Jalen financially afloat was not an act of paternal devotion. It was active participation in my own abuse. I had to let the house go. I had to liquidate my savings to clear the title because holding on to the physical structure meant holding on to the sickness. Many people might wonder why I did not scream at him in the hallway or demand a dramatic confrontation before I left the city. The answer lies in the fundamental preservation of personal energy. Anger is a highly expensive emotion. It drains your intellect and clouds your strategic vision. When you engage in a shouting match with a narcissist, you are playing their game on their home turf. They thrive on the chaotic energy of an argument because it allows them to manipulate the narrative and play the victim. By refusing to raise my voice or show a single ounce of emotional distress, I completely dismantled Jalen's power. I executed the silent adjustment. I took the raw explosive emotion out of the betrayal and treated it like a dangerously overloaded electrical circuit. When a breaker is sparking and threatening to burn down the entire building, you do not stand there and yell at the sparks. You calmly walk down to the main panel and you cut the power completely. That is exactly what I did. I severed the financial current. I removed the property from his control, and I physically removed myself from the blast radius. True power is walking away from a burning bridge without ever looking back at the flames. By maintaining my stoic composure, I forced Jalen to fight a ghost. He could not manipulate a man who was no longer in the room. He could not guilt-trip a father who had already legally transferred the estate to a faceless corporate entity. The silence I left behind was far more devastating than any harsh words I could have ever spoken. It forced him to sit alone in the empty house and finally listen to the loud, terrifying sound of his own incoming ruin. Now as I breathe in the clean mountain air, I have completely redefined my understanding of a legacy. A legacy is not a house made of brick and timber. It is not an offshore bank account or a portfolio of stocks. A true legacy is the positive impact you leave on the minds and hands of the next generation. My son rejected the values I tried to teach him, but that did not mean my knowledge had to die with me. Down in the valley, at the Community Youth Center, I have found a profound sense of redemption. I spend my afternoons standing in a dusty workshop, surrounded by young men who come from broken homes and overlooked neighborhoods. They do not have luxury cars or expensive tailored suits. They have rough hands, hungry minds, and a desperate desire to build something permanent. I teach them how to measure angles, how to wire a safe circuit, and how to respect the tools they hold. When I watch a 16-year-old boy successfully complete his first carpentry project, the pride in his eyes is worth more than all the gold in the world. They listen to my stories and they respect my experience. By redirecting my entire remaining fortune into a trade school scholarship fund, I ensured that my life's work will create 1,000 master builders instead of funding one ungrateful fraud. I took the resources Jalen tried to steal and turned them into a massive engine for community empowerment. I am 70 years old, But my true life's work has just begun. I am no longer defined by the son I lost. I am defined by the countless young men I am currently helping to save. The toxic branch was pruned so the rest of the tree could flourish. Every single day I wake up with a renewed sense of vigor. I no longer carry the crushing weight of another man's poor decisions on my back. My mind is completely clear and my heart is incredibly full. The simple act of teaching a young boy how to properly hold a hammer has brought me more genuine joy than any amount of money ever could. This brings me to the absolute core message I want to share with anyone listening to this story. You do not owe anyone your own destruction. It does not matter if the person demanding your sacrifice shares your last name, your blood, or your history. If a relationship requires you to surrender your dignity, your hard-earned security, or your basic peace of mind, it is not a relationship. It is a hostage situation. We spend entirely too much time agonizing over the guilt of cutting off toxic family members. We worry about what the neighbors will say. Let them judge. The people whispering behind your back are not the ones protecting your sanity. You must have the courage to draw a hard, uncompromising line in the sand. When you tolerate disrespect, you are actively training people how to treat you. You are handing them the blueprint to your own suffering. If I had stayed in that basement to appease Jalen, I would have died a bitter, broken man trapped in the dark while my son danced in the light of my stolen achievements. Instead, I chose to rescue myself. I chose to value my own peace over his comfort. It takes a monumental amount of strength to pack a single bag and walk away from everything, you know. But on the other side of that terrifying door is a freedom so absolute it will take your breath away. You must become the ruthless protector of your own sanctuary. You must be willing to let the old structures burn to the ground so you can build something new and beautiful from the ashes. I found my sanctuary high in these mountains, far above the noise and the deceit. I am sitting here today as living proof that your life is not over just because someone tried to discard you. You have the ultimate power to rewrite the ending of your own story. Do not wait for a corporate developer to buy your problems. Take control of the deed to your own life today. If my journey resonated with you or gave you courage, I want to hear from you. Please take a moment to leave a comment down below and share your own experiences. Tell me which city or country you are listening from. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace? How did you find the strength to set that final boundary? Your story might be the exact spark of inspiration someone else needs to finally reclaim their own life. If you found value in this narrative, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so I can continue sharing more stories of resilience, justice, and personal triumph. We are building a strong community here based on mutual respect and unbreakable dignity. Do not forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Remember that you hold the pen to your own life and it is never too late to write a new chapter. Thank you for listening. Stay strong, protect your peace, and always demand the respect you deserve. The world will try to test your boundaries, but you must remain